Hey, welcome back, friend. Grab your blanket, find the softest corner you can and settle in because tonight we are going somewhere a long, long way from here. Somewhere with no electricity, no Wi-Fi, no heated floors and absolutely no way to order food at midnight. But do not worry, it is going to be beautiful. Picture this. A dirt road barely wider than two horses walking side by side, flanked by bare oak trees, their branches clawing at a grey October sky. The ground is soft, it has been raining for 3 days straight, and each step makes that low, wet sound like the earth itself is sighing. A man on horseback passes through a small cluster of thatched roof cottages, nods at the few faces watching from doorways and disappears around the bend. He will not be back for months. And the people watching him go, they know it. That is the moment this story begins. Before we go any further, if you are someone who loses track of time listening to stories like this one, I would really love it if you hit subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely means the world and it helps me keep making these for you. And hey, drop a comment. Tell me where in the world you're watching from right now, what time it is and what you are doing. I love reading those more than you know. Now, if you have got a fan running or some soft background noise, perfect. If not, maybe crack a window just a little. Let the night in, and let us begin. We are in England. The year is somewhere around 1280. The place is a small village tucked into the Yorkshire wolds, a landscape of rolling chalk hills and shallow wind-sheltered valleys. The village has perhaps 40 households, maybe 200 people counting the children, the elderly and the priest. It has a church, the only stone building in the entire settlement. It has a mill pond. It has a reeve, who is the Lord's man, the one who keeps track of who owes what and makes sure the fields get worked. It has one road going out and one road coming in, and by the time October fades into November, that road becomes almost meaningless, because the village is for all practical purposes alone. Now, before you imagine something tragic, let me stop you right there. This was not a disaster. This was not an accident. This was simply how life worked for the vast majority of people in medieval Europe for hundreds of years. The rhythm of the year had two great halves, the half when the world was open, and the half when it was not. And the people who lived in these villages did not dread the closing. They prepared for it. They planned for it. They'd been doing it generation after generation since long before anyone alive could remember. But that does not mean it was easy. Let us talk about what isolated actually meant. There are around 3,000 known deserted medieval village sites in England alone. Warham Percy in Yorkshire is one of the most studied. Archaeologists have been excavating it since 1950, piecing together stone by stone and bone by bone what life looked like inside a community that existed for 6 centuries before it was finally abandoned. What they found was not primitive chaos. It was a remarkably organised world. Rows of longhouses with their small attached gardens called tofts and crofts laid out along a central trackway. A watermill on the stream below. Fields divided into long strips, each family working their portion. A church at the heart of everything. And in winter all of that activity contracted, pulled inward, like a fist closing. The medieval calendar had a very clear boundary. Winter officially began at Michaelmas, the feast of St. Michael the Archangel, falling on the 29th of September. It ended at Candlemas on the 2nd of February. That is roughly 18 weeks, 4.5 months, 126 days during which you lived almost entirely off what you had already stored, burned what wood you had already cut, and wore what clothing you already owned. There was no resupply. There was no running to the market in the next town. In many valleys, when the mud froze solid and the drifts piled against the hedgerows, there was simply no getting out at all. Now here is something that might surprise you. The medieval world did not always have the brutal winters we imagine. There was actually a period historians call the medieval warm period, which lasted roughly from about 750 to 1300. During those centuries, temperatures across Europe were mild enough that vineyards grew in England, yes, wine grapes in Yorkshire and the Midlands. Winters were cold, certainly, but survivable with reasonable preparation. Then, around 1300, something shifted. The climate began cooling. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. A little more rain than usual. Harvests that came in a bit short. Winters that held on a few weeks longer. This was the beginning of what scientists now call the Little Ice Age, a prolonged period of cooling that would last with fluctuations until the mid-19th century. The worst stretch historically was still a few decades away for our village in 1280, but the change was already being felt. Chroniclers of the time began noting hard winters and great frosts with increasing frequency. Rivers that had never frozen within living memory began icing over. The world our villagers knew was very quietly getting colder. So, our village. Late October. The last traveller has gone. The road is emptying. What does a woman named Agnes let us call her that? A name common in the English village records of this period. What does Agnes feel standing in the doorway of her longhouse, watching the road go quiet? She probably does not feel what we would feel. She does not feel the low-grade anxiety of someone cut off from the world, because for her the world was never all that far away to begin with. Her world was always this valley, these 40 households, this church spire, these fields she could walk across in 20 minutes. The road was for traders and priests and tax collectors, and frankly none of those were particularly welcome in November anyway. What she feels is something more like the particular alertness of a woman who has already done her mental accounting and knows exactly where things stand. She has checked the grain. She has counted the salt pork in the barrel. She knows how many candles are left, how much tallow she still has to render, whether the thatch on the east side of the roof is going to hold, or whether Thomas, her husband, needs to patch it before the first real frost. She knows which of the neighbours has had a bad harvest and might be coming to her door asking for something. She knows the priest will need eggs for the Advent masses and she has set aside a dozen. Agnes is not afraid of winter. Agnes has survived 19 of them, but she's paying very close attention. This is the part of the story that history books often skip over: the sheer cognitive load of surviving. A medieval winter was carried almost entirely by women. The men worked the fields, yes. They felled, timber, mended fences, drove the plough. But the labour of the household, the invisible, relentless year-round work of making sure a family stayed alive, fell to the women. And nowhere was this more true than in the weeks before the village closed. Consider what Agnes has done since September. She's taken the harvest and transformed it. Dried beans were spread on racks and turned daily so they would not mould. Onions were braided into long ropes and hung from the rafters. Peas were shelled, dried, and packed into cloth sacks. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, cabbages were buried in straw in the root cellar dug beneath the floor. Berries were boiled down into thick preserves and sealed in pots with beeswax. And the most labour-intensive task of all the November slaughter, before winter fully set in every household that owned a pig, and most did because a pig was the peasant's greatest single asset. A creature that could eat kitchen scraps and turn them into meat would slaughter it. The killing itself was quick. The work that followed was not. Every part of the animal had a purpose. The blood went into puddings. The fat was rendered into lard for cooking and tallow for candles. The intestines were cleaned and used as sausage casings. The hams and the sides were rubbed in salt and hung to cure. Nothing, not a single scrap was wasted. This was not philosophy. This was arithmetic. And the arithmetic was not always encouraging. Here is a calculation that would have haunted every household head in October. A family of 5, 2 adults, 3 children needed roughly enough food to survive 120 days of winter. An adult needed about 2 to 3 pounds of grain equivalent per day to maintain basic caloric needs. That is somewhere around 200 to 300 pounds of grain per person per winter, not counting children who needed somewhat less. Add the livestock, the cow, the pigs, the chickens who also needed to be fed through the cold. Subtract the portion owed to the church as tithe, which was 1/10 of everything. Subtract the rent to the Lord paid in kind. What remained was yours. In a good year this worked. In a bad year you started making very quiet, very painful decisions about which animals to feed and which ones to eat early, and whether the elderly grandmother could perhaps eat a little less, and whether the children's portion should be reduced because children can survive on less, which as it happens is not entirely true, but it was a calculation parents were sometimes forced to make anyway. This is what isolation meant, not romance, not simplicity. A closed road meant a closed system. What you had was what you had. Now let me take you somewhere slightly more comfortable before this gets too heavy, because I promise you the story of the medieval winter is not only hardship. There is warmth in it. Real warmth, the kind that comes from human beings crowding together when the world outside goes cold. The longhouse, the home of our Agnes and her Thomas and their 3 children, is smaller than your living room. Maybe 40 feet long and 15 feet wide, built of upright timber posts, filled in with wattle and daub, a woven framework of sticks packed with a mixture of clay straw, and let us say charitably other organic materials. The roof is thatched, low-sloping, and if it is well maintained, genuinely waterproof. The floor is packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes or straw. There is one central hearth, a raised stone platform in the middle of the room with no chimney, just a hole in the roof above it. The smoke goes up mostly when the wind cooperates, and at the far end of the room, separated by a low wattle partition, the livestock. The cow, the goat maybe, the chickens roosting in the rafters above the animals' space. In winter the animals came inside because a living animal generates heat. A large cow can produce roughly as much warmth as a small radiator, and because leaving livestock outside in a Yorkshire winter was a good way to lose livestock, and losing your cow in January meant losing your milk supply until spring, and losing your ploughing power in March, and losing a great deal else besides. So they came in. And yes, the smell was something, but the warmth was real. Here is a detail that tends to make modern audiences wince a little. Medieval people did not bathe very often in winter. Not because they were dirty by choice, but because heating enough water for a bath when wood was rationed was an extraordinary luxury. What they did instead was something called a strip wash, a damp cloth, some warmed water-targeted application. It worked tolerably well. What they were more vigilant about was keeping their clothing dry because wet wool in a cold house was genuinely dangerous. Wool, as any cold weather person will tell you, retains heat even when damp, but it works best in layers, and medieval people knew this. They dressed like onions. Linen against the skin, then wool, then more wool, then a heavy cloak if they had one. And they moved around a lot because stillness was the enemy. The cold inside a longhouse with a good fire going was not the bone-freezing cold of being outside. It was more like the persistent chill of a room that is never quite warm enough. You adapted. You wore your outdoor clothes indoors. You sat close to the fire at meals. You slept in a pile. Literally, a pile. The whole family sometimes with the nearest neighbours sharing body heat under rough wool blankets stuffed with fleece or dried grass. It was practical. It was also, if you let yourself see it clearly, quite tender. These were people who had known each other their whole lives in a village where your nearest neighbour's grandmother had delivered your mother into the world. The closeness of winter was not only physical, and that is where we are at the close of this first chapter. The road is closed. The harvest is in. The pig has been salted and hung. Agnes is standing at her fire, stirring a pot of pottage barley onions, a bit of dried bean, and the light from the flames is throwing warm shadows across the faces of her children. Outside, the first real cold of winter is pressing against the thatch. The village is quiet. The world beyond the valley is gone until spring, and they are as they have always been and as they always will be on their own. But here is what I want you to think about as you drift off tonight. We tell ourselves that isolation is the enemy of human life, that to be cut off is to be diminished. But these people, Agnes Thomas, their neighbours, the 40 households of this small Yorkshire valley, they built something in their isolation. Something dense and intricate and in its own way extraordinary. A world held together not by roads but by knowing that the woman 2 doors down keeps a pot of herb salve that works on frostbite, knowing that the miller's wife has more grain than she is letting on, and will share it in February when things get thin because she always does, knowing with deep and bone-level certainty the faces that will be there in the morning. In the parts ahead, we'll go deeper into that world, what they ate, what they feared, how the cold shaped their faith, their bodies, their children, their dreams. We will meet the wise woman who kept the village alive. We will find out what really happened on the darkest nights of December. And we will discover something that might genuinely surprise you about how much joy existed in a world with no light after sunset. Stay close. The winter is just beginning. Something funny happens when people picture a medieval home. They imagine it one of 2 ways. Either it is a fairy tale cottage, low beams, a roaring fire, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, everything warm and golden and smelling faintly of cinnamon. Or they imagine the other extreme, a damp, filthy, rat-infested hole in the ground, where miserable people huddled in the dark waiting to die. The truth, as usual, lives somewhere far more interesting than either of those. Let us go inside. The building you are entering is called a longhouse, not because it is particularly long, though at somewhere between 45 and 70 feet. It is longer than you might expect for a peasant home, but because of its shape. It is rectangular, low. The walls barely reach above your head at their highest point, and the roof, thatched thickly with rye straw or reeds, slopes down from a central ridge in a long, continuous curve like the back of a sleeping animal. From the outside, on a grey November morning with frost on the grass and smoke coming up through the thatch, it looks almost like the house grew there, like it belongs to the land the same way a hedgerow does. Inside, you step down slightly, the threshold is raised to keep water out, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. Wood smoke. Yes, wet wool, hay, animal warmth. And underneath all of that, something that is hard to name, but that every person who has ever spent time near livestock will recognize the particular deep organic smell of large animals breathing in an enclosed space. Because the animals are right there. Here is one of the most debated questions in medieval archaeology. Just how common was it exactly for people and livestock to share the same roof? For decades, historians assumed it was universal among peasant families. The image of a cow at one end and a family at the other, separated only by a low wattle hurdle, became almost a cliché of the period. The more careful answer, based on archaeological work at sites like Warren Percy, and a growing body of building analysis, is that it was common in specific regions, northern England and Wales especially, and that the practice became more widespread in the 13th century as a deliberate choice, not a poverty-driven accident. In the Beyer House, which is what archaeologists call these combined human-animal longhouses, the animals were not simply tolerated, they were strategically placed. A mature dairy cow produces roughly as much radiant heat as a large wood-burning stove somewhere around 2000 BTUs per hour. 3 or 4 cattle crowded together at the lower end of a longhouse could raise the temperature of the entire building by several degrees on a cold night. For a family burning through precious firewood reserves, that was not a trivial calculation. So when you step into this house and smell the animals, understand that smell is not evidence of squalor. It is evidence of intelligence. Now, your eyes are adjusting to the interior light, which is dim. Not romantically dim, uncomfortably dim. The only windows are small rectangular gaps in the wall, covered in winter with wooden shutters, or if the family was prosperous enough, stretched animal membrane bladder or stomach lining, that let in a diffused cloudy light without letting in much cold air. Real glass was extraordinarily expensive in the 13th century, available only to churches, nobility and the very wealthy. The Palace of Westminster had some of its windows glazed in the 1230s, and the court records of the time specifically noted that the chambers were less windy than they used to be. Less windy. That was the standard. Not warm, just less windy. For the family in this Yorkshire longhouse wind management was its own daily project. Cracks in the wattle and daub walls were stuffed with moss hay, and do not wrinkle your nose whatever organic material came to hand. The thatch on the roof was thick enough when well maintained to provide genuine insulation. Modern experiments on reconstructed medieval thatched buildings have found interior temperatures several degrees warmer than outside air, even without any fire burning, simply because of the insulating mass of a good straw roof. The problem was the fire. Let us talk about the hearth, because the hearth is the heart of this whole enterprise, and it is not what you think it is. There is no chimney. Not here, not in a common peasant longhouse of the late 13th century. Chimneys were a relatively recent innovation, spreading slowly from France into England over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, and they were first adopted in stone manor houses and castles buildings where the wealthy could afford the masonry work and where stone walls would not catch fire from the accumulated heat. In a thatched longhouse, the chimney was still rare. Instead, there is a flat stone platform in the centre of the earthen floor. On it a fire burns oak or ash, if they have it, which burns hotter and cleaner. Green or wet wood if they do not, which fills the room with billowing grey smoke. Above the fire, high in the ridge of the thatch, there is a hole, and the smoke is supposed to go up through that hole. It often does not cooperate. Wind direction matters enormously. On a day when the air is still, the smoke rises cleanly, and the longhouse is tolerable dim and warm in a rough way, smelling of wood and herbs. On a day when the wind is blowing from the wrong quarter, the smoke has nowhere to go, and the whole building fills up to eye level with a stinging, rolling haze that makes everyone's eyes water. Medieval people who lived this way did not have smoker's lungs from tobacco. They had smoker's lungs from their own homes. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from medieval village sites regularly shows evidence of chronic respiratory problems, particularly in women who spent more time indoors closer to the fire, doing the cooking and the spinning and the carding of wool. This was the original occupational hazard of domesticity. Have you ever thought about what it actually means to keep a fire burning through a winter? Not just for an evening, but for 18 weeks straight. In the medieval household, the fire was never allowed to go completely out. There was a practical reason for this beyond mere warmth. Striking a fire from scratch with flint and steel, and a bundle of dried fungus or tinder, was a slow, uncertain process that could take anywhere from a few minutes to the better part of an hour, and in a house where the temperature was already dropping toward freezing, you did not want to be doing that at 5 a.m. So instead the fire was banked at night, smothered under a layer of ash that kept the coals alive at low heat, and coaxed back to life in the morning by blowing carefully through a long hollow reed or metal tube until the embers caught. The word curfew comes directly from this practice. In French, couvre-feu, cover the fire. Church bells rang at nightfall in medieval towns as a signal that fires should be damped and covered, partly to conserve fuel, and partly because an uncovered hearth fire in a thatch-roofed town was one spark away from catastrophe. So the fire lived in the house the way a sick relative might always present, always needing attention, sometimes cooperative, sometimes demanding. The first thing Agnes did every morning was kneel by the hearth and coax it back. The last thing she did at night was cover it. Now about the firewood. This deserves more than a passing mention because the management of fuel in a medieval village was a genuinely complex social negotiation that modern people have almost no frame of reference for. Every household needed firewood. In a hard winter in Yorkshire, a family might burn through 6 or 7 cords of wood, that is roughly a stack 8 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and 4 feet high per cord, just to stay warm and cook their food through 4 winter months. Where did it come from? From the Lord's Forest, theoretically. But the Lord's Forest was governed by something called forest law, a body of regulations that restricted what peasants could take. They could collect fallen branches from the forest floor. This was called the right of Vestover. They could not cut living trees. They could not take timber. They certainly could not hunt. The line between lawful wood gathering and unlawful timber theft was patrolled by the Lord's Foresters, and the manorial court records of 13th century England are full of cases where a villager was fined for taking wood he was not supposed to take. One Yorkshire record from 1279 lists a villager named Richard of the Wold fined 12 pence, roughly 4 days' wages for a labourer for cutting a green bough from the forest in winter. 12 pence, when your family was cold. You can draw your own conclusions about what the tension in that village probably felt like. Let us move deeper into the house now past the central hearth to where the family sleeps. The sleeping arrangement in a medieval peasant longhouse has been, let us say, somewhat romanticised in the popular imagination. The reality was both more communal and considerably less romantic. The family 2 adults, and typically 3 to 5 children given the birth rates of the period, slept together. Not in separate beds, in a pile. On a raised wooden platform called a bedstead, if they were fortunate on a layer of straw on the floor, if they were not covered with rough wool blankets stuffed with sheep's fleece or in better households goose down. Sometimes a nearby neighbour family joined them on the coldest nights, sharing heat, the way animals do by proximity. This sounds strange to modern ears, but it made perfect physiological sense. The resting human body generates about 80 watts of heat. A couple with 3 children generates 400 watts. Add a neighbour family of similar size and you have something approaching 700 to 800 watts of sustained warmth in an enclosed sleeping space. That is real. That is the difference between a dangerous night and a survivable one. The children slept in the middle of the pile as the warmest position. The adults slept on the outside. This was not a written rule. It was just what you did if you loved your children, which most medieval parents did in spite of what some history books will tell you. I want to pause here for a moment because something important is worth sitting with. Medieval scholars writing in the 13th and 14th centuries had a theory about cold that shaped how people thought about their own suffering. The dominant medical framework inherited from ancient Greek physicians and filtered through Islamic scholars before reaching England held that the human body had 4 essential qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry, and that health depended on keeping these in balance. Cold in this system was not merely uncomfortable. It was a genuine threat to the body's inner fire, the vital heat that the ancients believed resided in the heart and was essential to life. Letting the body get too cold was not just unpleasant, it was medically dangerous because cold suppressed, the vital heat slowed, the digestion thickened the blood and opened the body to disease. What this means in practice is that medieval people felt the cold with a kind of existential weight that we, with our thermostats and downcoats and central heating, probably cannot fully recreate. Cold was not just a physical sensation. It was a moral condition associated by writers and preachers with poverty, with weakness, with the approach of death. When winter came, it came with a freight of meaning. And yet, this is the part that keeps catching me. Even in sources that describe the cold of winter in the bleakest possible terms, you find moments that are unmistakably human. A French manuscript from around 1300, a calendar of agricultural labour, shows two peasants in its January illustration. One is warming his bare feet at the fire, the other is holding a cup. Both of them are indoors with the door shut, and the room around them, though spare, has the particular warmth of a space where people have been living for a long time. The fire is big. The walls are hung with something. There is bread on the table. It is not a grand scene. But whoever drew it was not drawing despair. They were drawing something more complicated, something that looks from 700 years away, a little like ordinary happiness. Back to the building itself, because I have not yet told you what it was made of in any detail, and the details matter. The cruck frame, the structural skeleton of the longhouse, was built from matched pairs of curved oak timbers naturally bent in their growth, that were raised as arched bays and fitted together at the ridge. A modest longhouse might have 3 or 4 of these cruck pairs, each spaced about 15 feet apart, supporting the weight of the roof. The spaces between the crucks were filled with wattle young hazel or willow rods, woven in a basket pattern between upright stakes. The wattle was then plastered with daub, a mixture of clay-chopped straw and animal dung mixed to the consistency of thick cake batter, and applied by hand in layers smoothed and repaired annually as weather and time pulled it apart. The result, when freshly maintained, was a wall that was genuinely functional. The clay-straw mixture had real insulating properties. The thermal mass of a thick daub wall absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly at night, dampening temperature swings, the way a large body of water does. It was not perfect. It cracked. It needed constant upkeep. A winter of alternating freeze and thaw could open gaps large enough to put your hand through. But it was not a hut. It was a technology modest in its materials and remarkable in its accumulated wisdom. Medieval peasant homes were not the primitive hovels that 19th century historians once described them as being. Radiocarbon dating and tree ring analysis of surviving structures in the English Midlands, hundreds of them still standing now incorporated into farm buildings and village homes, have revealed that these buildings were constructed with considerable skill, repaired and maintained across generations, and capable of standing for a century or more when properly tended. The people who built them were not ignorant. They were working with the materials they had in conditions we can barely imagine, and doing it well enough that the buildings outlasted them by hundreds of years. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the longhouse before we move on, and it is the thing I find most quietly moving about the whole subject. The house was not just a shelter, it was a record. The hearth was the centre, and it was never moved. Whenever archaeologists excavate a medieval house site, they find the hearth, the reddened earth, the fire-cracked stones, sometimes a single hearthstone that has been in place for so long it has sunk slightly into the floor around it. Around the hearth they find the layered detritus of domestic life, broken pottery, animal bones gnawed clean, and tossed aside spindle whorls dropped, and never retrieved coins lost through the floor rushes a child's clay marble. These are not random objects. They are the physical record of specific evenings when someone was tired and dropped something, when a child was playing too close to the fire, when the best bowl finally cracked and got thrown out. The house held all of it. It absorbed the life of the people in it the way old walls absorb sound, not storing it exactly, but carrying some faint impression forward. When Agnes stood in her doorway at dawn, looking out at the frozen field, she was standing in a space that her grandmother had stood in, and her grandmother's grandmother before that. The same hearth, or one very close to it. The same roof patched and rethatched, but essentially the same shape against the same sky. The same smell of smoke and animal and wool and bread. There is something in that continuity that the modern world has mostly lost, and I think we feel its absence more than we know. So now you know what the house was. You know how it was built, how it was heated or not quite heated, how the smoke moved, how the family slept, how the animals contributed their quiet warmth to the whole enterprise of winter survival. But a house, however cleverly built, is just the container. What makes it a home is what happens inside it when the door is shut and the cold is pressing against the thatch from outside. And what was happening inside in the long dark weeks of a medieval winter turns out to be far more layered and surprising than you might expect. Because next we need to talk about food. Not just what they ate though, that story's remarkable in its own right, but the extraordinary, exhausting year-round labour of making sure there was anything to eat at all when February arrived, and the root cellar was running low, and the pottage had started to taste like old memory. Come a little closer to the fire, we are just getting started. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine this. It is late October. You're standing in a small cellar dug beneath the floor of your home, just a shallow pit really lined with straw and covered with a heavy wooden board. You're holding a candle stub and you are counting. Sacks of grain, bundles of dried beans, strings of onions hanging from a wooden peg, a small crock of salted butter sealed with a lard rind, 2 smoked flitches of bacon wrapped in cloth dangling from a beam, a handful of dried herbs tied with twine, a barrel of ale slightly sour already. You count again. You do the math you have done in your head every autumn since you were old enough to understand what the numbers meant. And then this is the part that stays with you. You decide whether what you have is enough, whether it will hold until February, whether your family will come through the other side. This was not a moment of drama in the medieval village. It was simply Tuesday. Food is where the story of the medieval winter gets serious in a way that no amount of atmospheric description quite captures. The house was uncomfortable. The cold was persistent. But cold does not kill you in weeks the way hunger does. And the entire structure of the medieval agricultural year, every choice about what to plant, when to harvest, how to store, how to preserve, what to eat first and what to save, was oriented around one central unforgiving fact. Between October and the following spring, you were living entirely off what you'd already produced. There was no grocery run, no neighbour driving into town, no church charity that could reliably fill a gap once the village's collective stores ran low. What you had was what you had, and the consequences of miscalculation were not abstract. Let us start from the beginning. The medieval agricultural worker, a man doing heavy field labour, which is to say lifting, hauling, ploughing and carrying for 10 to 12 hours a day, needed somewhere in the range of 4,000 to 4,500 calories daily, just to sustain his body weight and capacity to work. That is almost double what a typical modern desk worker needs. His wife managing the household, the cooking, the spinning, the garden, and the younger children needed roughly 2,100 to 2,300. Children varied, but a growing child of 10 doing light farm work needed close to 2,000. For a family of 5, 2 adults, 3 children of mixed ages, that adds up to roughly 11,000 to 12,000 calories per day. Across an 18-week winter, that is somewhere between 1,300,000 and 1,500,000 calories that need to already be sitting in your cellar before the first hard frost. When you translate that into actual food grain, mostly the backbone of the medieval diet, you're looking at an enormous amount of stored material. Academic estimates based on estate records and household accounts from 13th century England suggest that a typical peasant household needed to store somewhere between 8 and 12 bushels of grain per person per year, just for bread and pottage before calculating for livestock feed brewing and seed reserved for the following spring's planting, 8 to 12 bushels per person per year, and in winter you could not buy more if you ran short. This is why the harvest was not simply an agricultural event in the medieval calendar. It was a referendum on survival. Now, when people picture the medieval diet, they often land on one of two extremes. Either they imagine it as romantic and earthy dark bread garden herbs, ale by a crackling fire, or they imagine it as uniformly grim, a grey monotony of boiled grain and deprivation. The truth, as always, is more particular and more interesting than either version. Let us talk about what people actually ate. Bread was the absolute foundation. Not the light airy bread we know today, but a dense, dark, sometimes gritty loaf made from rye barley oats, or when the household was prosperous enough, a mixture of wheat with rye called maslin. A prosperous peasant household in the 14th century would consume 2 to 3 pounds of this bread per adult per day. That is a lot of bread. It was not a side dish, it was the meal, and everything else, the pottage, the occasional scrap of bacon, was the accompaniment. And then there was pottage. Oh, pottage! The word alone has an almost incantatory quality after a while, because it appears in every medieval household account, every description of peasant life, every reference to what common people ate in winter. Pottage was a thick stew of grains and whatever vegetables the family had managed to store or grow: field peas, onions, leeks, cabbages, turnips, parsnips. It was not a recipe so much as a principle. Put things in a pot of water, simmer over a fire for several hours, eat. The pot was rarely emptied and rarely fully cleaned. New ingredients were added to what remained from the previous day. On a good day, a bit of salted bacon went in. On a lean day in late January, it might be little more than water barley and a handful of dried peas. Archaeologists excavating at Warren Percy found carbonized fragments of barley and legumes in the fire debris of the hearths. The actual physical remains of actual pottage cooked in actual pots over actual fires by people who have been dead for 600 years. There is something in that evidence that refuses to stay merely historical. Someone made this, someone ate this, and went to bed and got up in the morning and did it again. But here is what I find genuinely underappreciated about medieval food, and it requires a small recalibration of assumptions that most of us carry without realizing it. The medieval peasant diet was not nutritionally empty. It was repetitive, yes, monotonous by our standards, certainly. But the combination of whole grain bread, legumes, onions, and root vegetables is by modern nutritional analysis a reasonably solid foundation. Peas and beans supplied protein and iron. Barley and oats supplied complex carbohydrates and fibre. Onions and cabbages supplied vitamins. The ale that everyone drank, not the strong stuff, but the small ale low in alcohol and high in residual B vitamins from the fermentation process, provided calories, and in a world without safe drinking water, a level of basic biological safety. A medieval English peasant in a good year was not eating badly in any absolute sense. The catastrophe was not in what the diet was during normal times. The catastrophe was in what happened when it contracted. Let me walk you through the mathematics of shortage, because this is something that I think gets lost in the romantic haze that surrounds medieval life in the popular imagination. By February, deep winter, 6 weeks from the end, 4 weeks. If you were lucky with the weather, a household that had miscalculated its harvest, or whose harvest had been poor, or who had given too much to the Lord or too much to the church, was running on fumes. Not dramatic starvation, not yet usually. Something subtler and more insidious. Reduced portions, thinner pottage, bread made with increasing proportions of peas and beans, substituted for grain, as the grain ran low, which produced a loaf that was heavier and darker and harder to digest. The ale gave out and was replaced with water. The last of the salted bacon was eaten in January. In this condition, semi-fasted cold, burning enormous amounts of energy just to stay warm, human immune function drops measurably. Medieval coroner's rolls from the late 13th and early 14th century record a significant spike in deaths not from direct starvation but from chest infections, fever, and what the records call simply weakness, a category that modern historians read as the predictable medical outcome of a body running below nutritional threshold when an infection came calling. This was the razor edge, not the dramatic cliff of outright famine that was rarer though it happened, but the slow, grinding attrition of a winter spent slightly under day after day until the body's reserves were simply gone. Now, the 11th of November, the feast of Saint Martin of Tours, Martinmas. If Michaelmas in late September was the official beginning of winter in the church calendar, Martinmas was the single most important practical day of the season, because Martinmas was slaughter day. The Anglo-Saxons, who had a gift for plain speech, called November the blood month, and on or around the 11th in every village in England and across most of northern Europe the pig was killed. The pig was not a minor figure in the medieval peasant economy. It was in many ways the backbone of it. Unlike cattle, which required good pasture and substantial grain, a pig could sustain itself largely by foraging. All autumn long, from September onward, the village pigs had been driven into the oak forest at the edge of the settlement to root for acorns, beech mast, and fallen nuts, a practice called pannage, for which the lord charged a fee naturally. The pigs came back in November, fatter than they had left, heavy with the fat reserves of autumn's acorn harvest, and then they were killed. The process was not quick, and it was not the work of one person. The killing itself was swift, a single cut to the throat, the blood collected immediately in a bucket, because blood was the base of pudding, and nothing was wasted. But the work that followed occupied the next several days. The carcass was scalded in boiling water and scraped clean of bristle. The fat was carefully separated and rendered into lard cooking fat for the winter, also essential for waterproofing leather and making tallow candles. The intestines were cleaned with extraordinary thoroughness and used as sausage casings. The hams and the sides were rubbed with salt at roughly 2 ounces of salt per pound of meat, which gives you some idea of how precious salt was and why controlling it was a form of power and hung to cure over the smoke of the fire. One reasonable-sized pig properly processed and salted might yield somewhere between 80 and 120 pounds of usable meat. For a family of 5 eating sparingly, that was protein for several months, not every day, but often enough to keep the pottage from becoming entirely colourless. The leftover fat, the tallow, became candles, and in a world where the sun set before 4 o'clock in the middle of December, candles were not a luxury. They were the difference between functional evenings and sitting in the dark until dawn. Can I ask you something? When was the last time you made something with your hands that you knew with absolute certainty your family's survival depended on, not metaphorically, literally? You made this, or you did not eat this winter. I ask because that relationship with food, the direct physical, personal relationship between labour and nourishment, is one of the things most thoroughly erased from modern life, and I think we sometimes lose track of what it meant to live inside it. For Agnes in our Yorkshire village, preserving food was not a hobby or a lifestyle choice. It was the most important skilled work she did all year. The quality of her salted pork, the thickness of her root cellar insulation, the precision of her grain accounting, these were not small domestic details. They were the difference between a family that got through February and one that did not. And she learned all of this from her mother, who learned it from her mother in a chain of transmitted practical knowledge that stretched back further than anyone in the village could trace. There were no cookbooks for people who could not read. There was no agricultural extension service. There was only the accumulated wisdom of women who had done this before passing it forward, in the particular way that practical knowledge passes not through instruction, so much as through being present when the work was done. One aspect of winter food storage that I rarely see discussed is the social dimension of it, the way the village's collective resources and the tensions around them became most visible precisely when those resources were tightest. Village communities across medieval England operated under a loose system of mutual obligation when it came to food. It was not charity exactly, that word implies a one-directional gift, and this was something more reciprocal and more complicated. A family that had a surplus in a good year was expected, not legally required, but socially expected, in the powerful way that community expectation operates in a world where everyone can see everyone's fields to be generous when a neighbour's stores ran thin. The neighbour's family that ate your grain in January was your labour in April, your help with the harvest in August, your extra hands if your roof blew off in March. The exchange was real and ongoing, even when it was never explicitly named as such. The tensions in this system appeared in the manorial court records. A family accused of hoarding grain in a year of shortage, a dispute over who owed what to whom after a lean winter, a widow who'd been refused help by a neighbour and brought the complaint before the reeve. These records are dry and procedural, but read between the lines and you can hear the specific exhausted anger of people who are hungry and have been denied what they believed they were owed. Winter, it turns out, was not only a test of individual households, it was a test of whether the village was actually a community. Here is the last thing I want to leave you with on the subject of food before we move on to something that I promise is slightly warmer in tone. Medieval people were not passive about hunger. They were inventive, practical, and when pushed, quite willing to push back against the conditions that made hunger possible. The historical record from late 13th century England contains dozens of cases of what the courts called per presture, encroachments, on the Lord's common land, clearings cut from the edges of the forest, small plots brought under cultivation without permission. These were not accidents. They were people quietly expanding their productive capacity because they had looked at their winter stores and decided they needed more. The Lord's courts fined them, they paid the fine, and then in many documented cases they kept the cleared land anyway. There is something in that particular stubbornness, that willingness to be fined and keep the garden, that I find deeply human across 700 years of distance. You can read it as defiance. You can read it as desperation. You can also read it as the completely rational decision of someone who had done the winter mathematics and was not prepared to come up short again. Food in a medieval village was never just food. It was safety, power, love, and the specific daily expression of a determination to still be here in the spring. And it is that determination, that particular human refusal to simply accept what the season had decreed, that wins through everything else we're going to explore tonight. Because next we're going inside the most demanding of all the winter's indoor labours, the work that never stopped, that began before the light and ended after it, that dressed the entire village from November to April. Work that fell almost entirely on the hands of women, and that the history books until fairly recently mostly forgot to mention. The wool is on the floor, the spindle is in her hand, and the fire is low, but it is burning. Right now, wherever you're lying down, sitting up, maybe curled under something warm, I want you to notice your hands for a moment. Just notice them. Resting. Still. Not doing anything in particular. In a medieval village in December, a woman's hands were never still. Not at dawn, not by midday, not at the edge of sleep in the last 20 minutes before the fire burned too low to see by, and the darkness made everything stop. The hands moved. The fingers pulled, the spindle turned, and the thread impossibly fine, impossibly long grew. That is where we are going tonight, into the specific, relentless, largely uncelebrated world of winter work. The labour that kept a village clothed and lit and functional across 4 cold months when the fields were frozen and the road was gone. And the truth about who carried the weight of most of it. Start with the darkness because it shapes everything else. On the 21st of December, the winter solstice, the pivot point of the medieval year, the sun in Yorkshire rises at roughly 8 in the morning and sets before 4 in the afternoon. That is less than 8 hours of usable daylight. In November and January, the numbers are not much better, 7.5 to 8 hours of grey, often cloud-filtered light that filtered through animal membrane windows at roughly half the intensity of what reaches you outdoors. By 4 o'clock in a thatched longhouse with shuttered windows and a single fire, it was dark. Not the soft, manageable darkness of a modern home with a lamp switched off. Genuinely dark. The kind of dark where you could not see your hand in front of your face if you moved 2 feet from the hearth. The medieval world ran on a very short working day in winter, not by choice, by physics. And the things that could be done in that contracted daylight, the indoor work, the handwork, the work that needed light but not the full light of an outdoor afternoon, had to be organised around the fire with extraordinary precision. Because light in a peasant household of the 13th century was nearly as precious as food. Tallow candles were the light source of the common household. Not beeswax. Beeswax was expensive, reserved for churches and the tables of the wealthy. Tallow, which is rendered animal fat beef or sheep sweet, mostly produced a candle that burned with a yellowish, slightly smoky flame, and gave off, when you read period accounts, honestly a persistent and not entirely pleasant smell. The 13th century records of several English cities include ordinances banning the rendering of tallow within certain distances of residential areas, which tells you something about the olfactory experience of medieval candlemaking day. The fat came from the Martinmas slaughter we talked about previously, the rendered-off sweet that was boiled, clarified and poured over linen wicks, in a process that required several dippings each layer, allowed to cool and harden before the next application. A well-made tallow candle might burn for 3 to 4 hours, so an evening of household work lit by 2 or 3 candles consumed candles that had taken considerable labour to produce from fat that had taken considerable labour to save. This is the economy of light. Every hour of working by candlelight had a cost. People counted the hours, they counted the candles, and they worked by the fire when they could because the fire was free. Now, the spindle. If there is one object that defines the interior life of a medieval winter, one tool that appears in more manuscript illustrations, more household inventories, more passing references in estate records and legal documents than any other, it is the drop spindle with its distaff. A simple device, a short wooden shaft weighted at one end with a disc called a whorl made from clay or lead or carved stone. The distaff, a forked stick or a long rod, held the prepared raw wool. You drew the fibres out with your fingers, twisted the spindle to put in the twist, and the thread formed. It sounds uncomplicated. It was not. Spinning a single yard of thread, 1 yard 36 inches by hand, spindle took roughly 2 to 3 minutes for an experienced spinner working at a decent pace. A 1 yard square piece of woven cloth required close to 1,900 yards of thread, 900 for the warp, another 900 for the weft with some wastage. At 2 minutes per yard, that is over 60 hours of spinning just for 1 square yard of fabric. 1 rough tunic for a child, perhaps 2 square yards of cloth represented well over 120 hours of spinning before the weaving even began. A medieval household needed to produce cloth for clothing, for bedding, for bags, for sacking, for basic repairs to practically everything. The need was perpetual. The production rate by hand spindle was brutally slow, and so the spinning was constant. A common joke in medieval England, it turns up in more than one source, was that a woman was never without her spindle. And this was not entirely a joke. Women spun while walking between tasks. They spun while watching children. They spun while tending the fire and waiting for the pottage to thicken. The distaff tucked into the belt, the spindle working in the freehand thread, growing inch by inch through every spare minute of the day. The 14th century rhyme attributed to John Ball, one of the leaders of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, used this as his central image of womanhood. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, spinning that specific continuous never-finished act was how medieval society understood the labour of women, not as a metaphor, as a literal daily reality. Here is something that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. The spinning wheel, which we tend to imagine as the quintessential medieval textile tool, probably because of fairy tales, was actually a relatively new technology in the 13th century. It had arrived in Europe from Asia sometime around 1200, and in England it was still spreading, still being adopted in fits and starts across the following decades. For the majority of the medieval period, and for most common households, well into the 14th century, the thread was made the old way drop spindle distaff hands. The spinning wheel did eventually change everything. It was estimated to be roughly 10 times faster than the drop spindle for producing a given weight of thread. The economic consequences of that improvement were enormous. It contributed directly to the expansion of the English wool trade in the late medieval period, and eventually through a chain of improvements and incentives that one could trace step by step to the Industrial Revolution several centuries later. The spinning wheel is in a real sense the device that started the modern world. But in our village in 1280, most of the women are still working with the older tool, fingers, spindle, whirl, thread. Now the men were not idle. Let me be precise about that, because the indoor winter labour of medieval men has its own texture and its own interest. The fields were frozen. The ploughing would not restart until Plough Monday, the Monday after Epiphany on the 6th of January, when the priest blessed the plough and the working year officially resumed. In the interval between November and January, the heavy outdoor agricultural work essentially stopped. But a medieval household had tools. Tools broke. Tools wore out. And without functioning tools, nothing happened in spring. So the men repaired. A wooden ploughshare that had cracked at the joint needed to be re-soaked and bound. Leather harnesses went stiff in the cold and needed to be worked with lard until they were supple again. Wooden tool handles for hoes, for spades, for the long-handled forks used in the fields, split from the cycle of wet and freeze, and needed to be replaced from seasoned ash or oak stored in the barn. The cooper, if the village had one, spent winter making and repairing the barrels that held everything from grain to ale to salted pork. The basket weaver and almost every village had someone who did this using willow rods, harvested in the cold months when the sap was down, worked indoors in the firelight, the wet withies supple between his fingers, shaping baskets that the whole village needed for the coming year. And in the dusk of December afternoons, with the wind outside and the fire burning lower than anyone wanted, you could hear the sound of stone on metal, the rhythmic scraping of a knife being honed, or a scythe blade being worked with a whetstone, in the half-dark of a longhouse that smelled of wool and smoke and the particular earthy warmth of animals at rest nearby. Have you ever tried to do precise handwork in bad light? Really fine work, threading a needle maybe, or reading small text or repairing something delicate. There is a particular strain that comes from concentrating your eyes in insufficient light. You lean in closer, your shoulders tighten, your eyes ache in a way that is different from ordinary tiredness. After an hour of it, you want nothing more than to stop. After 4 hours of it, night after night, week after week, you develop a relationship with darkness that is probably hard to fully appreciate if you have never lived inside it. Medieval people adapted the way human beings always adapt. They arranged their work to maximize the available light. Women spinning or sewing positioned closest to the firemen doing rougher repairs that could be done by feel as much as sight positioned slightly further out. Neighbours gathered together in the larger longhouses precisely because pooled firelight was better than separate smaller fires in separate smaller homes. These winter gatherings, the historians call them veillées in the French tradition, and something similar certainly existed in England, were at once practical and social. You brought your spindle, you brought your mending, you sat together in the firelight and you worked and you talked and you listened and you told stories, and somehow the work went faster. The candle situation, by the way, was stratified in the same way that everything in medieval England was stratified. For the common household, tallow candles, homemade, slightly smoky, smelling of rendered sweet, burning for a few hours before guttering down. For the church, beeswax, the good stuff, clean and bright, reserved for religious ceremonies and the tables of the nobility. The smell of beeswax, that particular sweet honey-adjacent warmth, was for a medieval peasant the smell of the sacred, the smell of wealth. Something encountered in church at Christmas and not much otherwise. In England, the craft of candle-making became formalised as a guild trade in the 13th century, which means that by the time of our Yorkshire village there were professional chandlers in larger towns, producing candles for sale, both tallow for common use and beeswax for those who could afford it. But for Agnes and her neighbours, the candles were homemade, made from the fat saved from the November slaughter, made in a single intensive session, in early winter counted out for the season ahead, and used with careful economy. A household might budget 1 candle per working evening. A single tallow candle burning for 3 to 4 hours was the entire evening's light. When it went out, the work stopped and people slept. This is why the medieval world slept in 2 shifts, a practice so unfamiliar to us that it sounds invented, but which is actually documented in numerous medieval sources and confirmed by historical sleep researchers. People in the pre-industrial world typically slept for a first period of 3 to 4 hours after dark, then woke for a middle-of-the-night interval of an hour or so, thinking, praying, having quiet conversations, sometimes getting up to tend the fire or check on the animals, and then slept again until dawn. The full consolidated 8-hour sleep we consider normal is apparently a modern invention, possibly driven by artificial light extending the evening and compressing the night. Medieval people, working by the rhythm of natural darkness, slept differently, and in a strange way you might argue more naturally. Now I want to bring you back to Agnes, because she's been working this whole time while we've been talking about her. She's at the fire, and it is early evening in December. The shortest day of the year is a week away. Outside, the wind is finding the gaps in the thatch and making the flame lean sideways every few minutes, and she reaches over periodically to steady the pot on its trivet without looking up from her hands, because her hands know what they are doing and do not need her eyes. She is spinning. She has been spinning since the light was enough to see by roughly 8 this morning, and she will spin until the candle goes out at round 9 o'clock, with a break at midday for the pottage, and another in the afternoon to feed the cow and check the root cellar, and mend the younger child's boot where the sole was coming loose. In the intervals when her back ached too much for the sustained posture of spinning, she's been combing the raw fleece between 2 paddle-shaped brushes set with wire teeth to align the fibres before spinning. Carding and spinning, spinning and carding, with occasional stretches of more demanding work cutting cloth stitching by the fire, waxing the thread to make it stronger. She's been doing this since she was 5 years old, learning beside her mother. Her hands are fast, Her thread is consistent. The whirl of her spindle is a smooth disc of pale limestone that she picked up from the field edge 6 years ago and bored through herself with a bone awl. It is her tool shaped to her hand, weighted to her preference. When the thread breaks, and all thread breaks, eventually a small disaster that requires the spinner to stop, find the end, rejoin it, and carry on without losing the rhythm. She rejoins it without changing expression, the way an experienced driver navigates a bend in the road without consciously deciding to turn the wheel. She's doing something extraordinary by any objective measure. She's converting raw animal fibre into a material that will eventually become clothing. She's manufacturing by hand one of the most fundamental necessities of human life, and she's doing it in the dark by a smoky fire, while also keeping track of the children and the food and the temperature of the room and the level of the candle stub and the sound of the wind outside that might mean a change in the weather. And when you ask her what she did today, she will not have a good answer, because what she did today does not quite have a name. There is one more piece to this winter labour that I want to mention before we move on, and it sits slightly outside the usual telling of the story. The darkness was not only logistical, it was psychological. Bartholomew the Englishman, writing his great encyclopedia of natural knowledge in the 13th century, one of the most read reference works of the medieval period, described winter in terms that modern readers will find remarkably frank. Cold had mastery over moisture, he wrote, and things that had lived and sprang in summer now faded and died under winter's cruelness. In the later medieval symbolic vocabulary, winter was explicitly associated with old age poverty and the approach of death. It was the symbolic inverse of spring. It was the season of what had been, not what would be. This was not mere literary convention. It was a description of something people felt. The compressing of the day, the weeks of grey light and early dark, the cold that made the body work harder for warmth and left less energy for everything else, these things had real effects on mood and cognition that modern science has now confirmed with considerable precision. The symptoms we call seasonal affective disorder, low energy, increased sleep, reduced motivation, a heaviness that settles somewhere behind the eyes are not a modern pathology. They are a biological response to reduced light that human beings have always experienced and that the medieval world simply did not have a clinical name for. What the medieval world had instead was ritual. The Advent season that began in late November and built through December was, among many other things, a managed relationship with darkness, a framework of candle-lighting prayer and liturgical anticipation that gave the long, dark nights a purpose and a direction. The candles lit in church on Sundays of Advent, one more each week, the light increasing as the solstice approached, were not only symbolic of the coming of Christ, they were also in a very immediate physical sense more light in the dark. On the darkest Sunday of the year, 4 candles burned on the Advent wreath, and that was not nothing. Come December the 21st, the village had arrived at the bottom of the long descent. 6 hours and 42 minutes of pale daylight in Yorkshire that year. After this, almost imperceptibly at first, the light began to come back. Agnes knew this. Every woman working a spindle in every cold longhouse in England knew it, because the medieval mind tracked the seasonal calendar with a precision that we with our phones and weather apps and centrally heated homes no longer need. They watched the light the way a hungry person watches a pot with close attention, and with the specific quiet patience of someone who has been through this before and knows that the pot eventually does boil. The solstice passed. The light began its slow return. The spinning continued, and somewhere in the village, in a cold room with a low fire, a man was sharpening the plough iron for spring. The blade caught the firelight and threw a bright arc across the wall. His daughter, 7 years old and sitting beside him with a handful of raw fleece and a small spindle, looked up at the light, then back down at her hands and kept working. What comes next in the story of this village is in some ways the hardest part, and I say that knowing we have already talked about cold and hunger and darkness, because what I want to tell you about is what happened when the village got sick, when the healer was summoned, when the old woman who knew things everyone needed went out in the dark with her basket of dried herbs and her small clay pot of this and that, and tried to hold the line between a family that would survive the winter and one that would not. She has been here all along on the edge of the story. It is time to put her at the centre of it. She's been in this village her entire life. 62 years, perhaps 63, she has lost count and nobody wrote it down. She knows every family. She has been at every difficult birth for the last 30 years. She has sat with the dying more times than she can remember. Her name is Edith, let us call her that, a solid English name common as oak in the 13th century, and her hands, which have been doing this work longer than most people in the village have been alive, are the most competent hands within a day's walk in any direction. She has no license. She has no degree, she has no Latin, she has everything that actually matters. Winter was when Edith worked hardest. This is not a sentimental observation. It is a medical reality. The cold months brought a specific and reliable cluster of ailments that anyone who had lived through enough Yorkshire winters learned to recognise the way a farmer recognises a particular shade of cloud. Chest infections, what modern medicine would call pneumonia, pleuritis, bronchitis, were the great winter killers. Frostbite in the extremities, particularly in children sent out to tend animals in inadequate footwear. Fever without obvious cause. The persistent grinding ill health that came from weeks of reduced nutrition. Cold air and sleeping too close to a smoky fire. And periodically, not every winter, but often enough to be a recurring dread, something worse that swept through the village quickly took 2 or 3 people before it burned out and left the survivors shaken. There were no licensed physicians in a village like ours. The first European medical school, Salerno in Italy, later Bologna, later Montpellier in France, had been producing trained physicians since the 11th and 12th centuries, but those physicians went where the money was. They served bishops' lords, wealthy merchants, and anyone else who could pay their considerable fees. For the 40 households of a Yorkshire village in 1280, there was Edith, and her basket of dried herbs and her clay pot of rendered fat mixed with this and that, and 62 years of watching what worked and what did not. Let me tell you about the medicine she practiced, because it is considerably more interesting and more effective than the popular imagination usually allows. The foundational text of English village medicine in this period was not a university textbook. It was something much older and much stranger, a body of knowledge transmitted almost entirely by word of mouth, from mother to daughter and grandmother to granddaughter, reaching back through generations so far that nobody alive could say where it had begun. But alongside that oral tradition, and intersecting with it in complicated ways, there was also a written tradition of herbal medicine that had been accumulating since before the Norman conquest. The most important surviving document of this tradition is a remarkable manuscript known as Bald's Leech Book, a 10th century Anglo-Saxon medical compilation, possibly produced under the influence of the educational reforms of King Alfred the Great, now held at the British Library in London. Bald was the man who commissioned it. Sild was the scribe who wrote it down. It is organised with striking methodical clarity from head to toe, remedies for ailments of the head, then the chest, then the abdomen, then the extremities, then internal disorders, then specific injuries. It draws on Greek and Roman medical sources filtered through Islamic scholarship, combined with Anglo-Saxon herbal knowledge that predated any Mediterranean influence. and some of it modern researchers have discovered actually worked. In 2015, a team at the University of Nottingham tested one of the eye salve recipes from Ball's Leech Book, a preparation combining garlic leek wine and ox bile, fermented in a bronze vessel against the antibiotic-resistant bacteria MRSA. The salve eliminated up to 90% of MRSA in laboratory conditions. What the Anglo-Saxon healers had stumbled onto through centuries of empirical observation with no understanding of bacterial biology was an effective antimicrobial preparation. They did not know why it worked. It worked anyway. Edith did not have Ball's Leech Book. She almost certainly could not read. But she had knowledge that descended from the same tradition, practical tested, accumulated over generations, and she had a garden. The medieval healer's garden was not decorative. It was the closest thing a village had to a pharmacy. From spring through late summer, Edith would have grown and harvested and carefully dried the plants that made up her winter medicine chest. Yarrow Achillea millefolium, the soldier's herb, so-called, because it was used to pack wounds and stanch bleeding on battlefields, also made an effective tea for fevers, and its antimicrobial properties, like those of the eye salve, have been confirmed by modern laboratory analysis. Elderberry, which medieval English villagers planted near their homes and regarded as almost sacred, was boiled into syrups and draughts for coughs and respiratory infections. Modern clinical trials have since confirmed that elderberry preparations genuinely reduce the duration and severity of influenza-type illness. Willow bark, the active ingredient of which is salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid. The compound from which aspirin is synthesized was brewed as a tea for fevers and aches. Comfrey, known in medieval England as bone knit, was applied as a poultice for fractures and torn flesh. It contains allantoin, a compound that genuinely accelerates tissue repair, hyssop and horehound for respiratory conditions, chamomile for stomach disorders and to settle a feverish child, thyme sage and linden flower for colds and sore throats. Were there things in Edith's medicine chest that did not work? Absolutely. Were there preparations that were simply superstitious, or based on a misunderstanding of what caused illness, or carried over from a tradition old enough that nobody remembered why they were done? Of course. Medieval medicine was not modern medicine. It was a mixture of genuine empirical effectiveness and elaborate symbolic thinking, and separating the two was not something that the practitioners themselves always did, or even attempted, but the effective parts were genuinely effective, and in a world without hospitals, without licensed physicians, without antibiotics or analgesics, or any of the pharmaceutical infrastructure we take entirely for granted, even partial effectiveness was the difference between life and death. Think about what it meant in practical terms to be sick in a medieval winter. You could not see a doctor. The nearest trained physician was for most Yorkshire villages at least a full day's ride away in York or some other substantial town, and in winter, with the roads, what they were, that distance might as well have been the moon. You could not rest completely because the fire needed tending and the animals needed feeding and the children needed watching, and none of those things stopped because you were ill. You could not eat well because in deep winter the diet was already at its thinnest. You could not stay warm, not in a longhouse, where the temperature dropped to near freezing by morning, unless the fire was constantly managed. What you could do was call for Edith. She came at night mostly. Not because illness respected daylight hours, but because the most serious cases, the ones where the fever had been climbing for 2 days, the ones where the breathing had become laboured, the ones where a child had been found with fingers white and waxy from the cold, these tended to come to a crisis in the night hours. There is a physiological reason for this. Body temperature naturally drops in the early hours of the morning, and what is manageable in the afternoon can become dangerous at 3 o'clock when the fire has burned low. She came with her basket, She examined what she found, and then she worked with what she had. Let me walk you through what a chest infection looked like in a medieval village in December, because the details are not what most people expect. The patient is a man named William, let us call him that, 40 years old, which in the 13th century puts him in middle age. He's had a cough for 6 days, worsening since Tuesday. The cough is producing material the medieval texts call it phlegm, and the colour and consistency of the phlegm was one of the primary diagnostic indicators available, because the humoral medical system that governed medieval thinking held that the balance of the body's fluids, blood phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, determined health and sickness, and the appearance of those fluids told you which way the balance was off. Yellow or greenish phlegm indicated that the body was producing too much of the hot-dry qualities. Treatment in that framework called for cooling and moistening interventions. Edith does not think about it in these terms precisely. She has not read the Greek and Latin texts that formulated the humoral theory. But she has absorbed through decades of practice a practical working version of the same framework, one that tells her that a hot, dry fever needs to be cooled and that a cold, wet chest needs to be warmed. Her tools for the fever: an elderberry draught steeped and cooled to be given every few hours, a cloth dampened in cold water laid on the forehead. And this is less obvious: the careful management of the room temperature, keeping the fire burning steadily rather than high, because a room too hot for a feverish patient was as dangerous as a room too cold. For the chest, a preparation of hyssop and thyme boiled in water, the steam directed at the patient's face with a cloth tent, an inhalation treatment so effective that it has survived in refined form as a standard home remedy into the present day. Warm ale with honey for the throat. A poultice of comfrey on the chest if the pain was severe. And most importantly, and this is the thing that a trained physician of the period would have done first, the instruction to lie still, to be kept warm, to be given warm fluids, and to be watched through the night. Here is a detail from the historical record that tends to startle people. At the University of Paris in November of 1322, a woman named Jacoba Felicia de Almania was put on trial by the Faculty of Medicine. Her crime was practicing medicine without a university license. The charges were brought because she was successfully treating patients, including patients whose licensed physicians had given up on them, and her success was embarrassing to the official medical establishment. 8 witnesses testified on her behalf. One of them declared that she was a better physician and surgeon than any licensed practitioner in Paris. The faculty convicted her anyway, because she was a woman and because she had no degree. This was not happening in Edith's village in Yorkshire. In a village without any licensed physician at all, the question of who was allowed to practice medicine did not arise. Edith practiced because she was the only one who could, and the village needed her. And that was the end of the discussion. The legal restrictions that were beginning to descend on urban women healers in the 13th and 14th centuries, driven by the medical schools and the male professional class they were producing, had not yet reached the rural hinterland in any practical way. Out here in a hamlet half a mile from the nearest road, the law was largely theoretical. But the Jacoba Felicia case and others like it tell us something important about the larger story of which Edith is a part. In early medieval Europe, healing was understood as the natural province of women, mothers, wives, elder women of the community. The knowledge that had accumulated in the hands of women over centuries was vast, practical, and effective. The professionalization of medicine in the 12th and 13th centuries, driven by universities that admitted only men, did not make medicine better for most people. It simply made medicine exclusive. And the women who had been doing the work all along were gradually in the towns and cities pushed out, restricted, and eventually, in the worst cases, accused of witchcraft for doing what their grandmothers had done. In the village for now, Edith was still safe, still necessary, still the person you called when the fever would not break, something worth pausing on. What did Edith believe about illness? This is not a trivial question, and the answer is more layered than a simple contrast between superstition and reason would suggest. The medieval understanding of disease drew on three overlapping frameworks, none of which fully excluded the others. The first was the humoral framework, the inherited Greek system of hot, cold, wet, and dry, which gave healers a rational vocabulary for describing illness and a systematic approach to treatment. It was wrong about the mechanisms of disease in ways that mattered enormously, but it was not arbitrary. It was a coherent system that made predictions and could be tested against outcomes, and practitioners updated it when they needed to. The second was religious. Illness in the medieval worldview was not merely biological, it was potentially divine, a punishment, a test, a message from God. The priest and the healer were not always distinct figures, and the line between medicine and prayer was fluid. Edith would have seen the priest called when her interventions had done what they could. She would have seen patients who recovered and attributed their recovery to St. Roch, or to the Virgin, or to the particular prayers said over them by the priest. She would have seen patients who did not recover despite everything. Her faith was as real as her herbalism, and she did not experience them as contradictions. The third was what historians sometimes call folk or empirical, the accumulated practical knowledge that came from direct observation, outside of any formal framework, and that sometimes preserved genuine medical insight in forms that looked superficially like superstition. The instruction to keep a feverish patient in a ventilated room rather than a sealed one, which appears in several medieval medical sources, is medically sound. The instruction to dispose of the waste materials from a sick person at a distance from the water supply is medically sound. The instruction to isolate someone with a highly contagious illness from the rest of the household is medically sound. These practices were often framed in religious or magical terms. The waste must be taken far away, so the evil does not return. The sick person must be separated so the illness spirit cannot jump. The framework was wrong. The behavior was right. Can I ask you something that I find myself thinking about every time I sit with this history? How much of what we know today, the medicines we take, the procedures we trust, the advice we follow, rests on exactly this same kind of accumulated empirical knowledge that nobody fully understood at the time aspirin was in use for decades before anyone worked out the mechanism. Penicillin was discovered by accident and used for years before its action on bacteria was fully characterized. The practice of hand-washing before surgery was introduced by Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1840s and rejected by the medical establishment for 30 years before germ theory finally gave it a theoretical foundation. The practice itself was right. The theory came later. Edith, in her way, was doing the same thing. Observing outcomes, adjusting practice, passing on what worked, doing it in a context shaped by humoral theory and religious faith, yes, but using plants that contained compounds which genuinely reduced fever, inhibited bacterial growth, promoted tissue repair, and eased respiratory inflammation. Not by coincidence, by centuries of careful watching. By February, in a hard winter, Edith had usually lost someone, not always. In a good year in a village where the harvest had been adequate and the winter not too brutal, she might get everyone through. But in a year where the food stores had run thin, and the cold had been persistent, and the illness that went around had been particularly virulent, there would be at least one family sitting in their longhouse, with a gap in it that had not been there in October. The death of a villager in winter was handled with a particular kind of quiet practicality that is difficult to describe without sounding cold, which it was not. The dead were laid out in the church, which was the one stone building in the village, and therefore the coldest, essentially a natural cold storage which served a practical purpose in winter, when the ground was frozen too solid to dig. The priest said what needed to be said. The family gathered. And then the village went on because it had to, because there were still animals to feed and fires to tend and children who were still alive and needed to eat. The grief was real. The resilience was also real. These two things coexisted in a way that people who have not lived close to mortality, people who have not spent winters where the question of who would still be here in spring was genuinely open, may find difficult to hold together. Edith had held them together for 62 years. Winter sickness is not only what comes from the cold, it is also what the cold reveals the vulnerabilities already present in a body or a household, or a community brought to the surface by the particular pressures of the season. The family with the thin harvest was the family most likely to have a child who did not recover from what in better conditions would have been a manageable illness. The elderly man whose body had been working at the edge of its capacity since October was the one most likely to be felled by the chest infection that his younger neighbour shook off in a week. Edith knew this. She did not have a word for it. No concept of immunity, no understanding of the relationship between nutrition and immune function, no vocabulary for what we would call comorbidities. But she had 62 years of pattern recognition, and she knew which households to check on first when the bad weather set in, and which children to watch more closely than others, and which coughs to treat with urgency, and which to wait out. She was not a physician. She was something older than that, and in her particular context more useful. And yet winter in the village was never only darkness and illness, and the cold weight of survival. Running alongside the hardship braided through the long dark evenings and the smoky rooms and the careful rationing of food and light was something else entirely, something warmer and louder and considerably more human, because when the work was done and the fire was low and the children had been tucked in for the first sleep, the village did not simply sit in silence and endure. It told stories, it sang, it played games, it celebrated with the particular fervency of people who understood what darkness actually was, the returning of the light. That is the part of the winter we have not told you yet, the part that I think is the most surprising, and it is coming right up. Forget for a moment everything you think you know about medieval Christmas, because the version most of us carry in our heads, the quiet candlelight, the reverent hymns, the dignified procession to church through a dusting of snow, is historically speaking roughly half the story. The other half involves a peasant being elected to mock the lord of the manor to his face, clergy burning old shoes as incense, men dressed as women careening through the village in the dark making as much noise as humanly possible, and a bowl of spiced ale so large that it took 2 people to carry it. The medieval Christmas was at its best a magnificent act of collective insanity. And for the frozen, food-rationed, darkness-worn village we've been living inside for the past several chapters, it was also the most important thing that happened all winter. Not just as entertainment, as survival. Let us start with the calendar, because the medieval Christmas was not a day, it was a season. Advent began 40 days before Christmas. In the older reckoning, a period of fasting restraint and spiritual preparation that made the celebration that followed feel genuinely earned. By the 13th century in England, Advent had been compressed to the 4 weeks we still recognise, but the fasting remained. No meat, no rich food, no feasting. For the peasant household that had already been eating reduced rations since October Advent, was one more layer of austerity on top of an already thin diet. The austerity of Advent was not merely spiritual. It was practical, a way of stretching the food stores a little further into the season before the celebration began. And then at midnight on December the 24th, everything changed. The church on Christmas Eve was the brightest building the village would see all winter. Every candle the parish possessed was lit, and in some churches, Additional beeswax tapers were brought from the Lord's household, giving the stone interior a warmth of light that was genuinely extraordinary by the standards of a community that spent its evenings by a single tallow stub. The villagers came through the cold to the midnight mass Christa Mace, from which the English word Christmas derives, and stood in that blazing light and sang. For people who'd been living in near darkness since October, the effect was not merely aesthetic, it was physiological. It was light, real light in the middle of the darkest night of the season, and it felt like a promise. Christmas Day itself was the first of 12 days that ran until the 6th of January, the Feast of the Epiphany, which marked the arrival of the three Magi at the manger, and was in the medieval understanding in some ways the more important conclusion. During these 12 days, by tradition and by manorial law, no tenant was required to work the Lord's fields. This was not a courtesy. It was a legal obligation on the part of the Lord, and the 12 days of enforced holiday from field labour represented for the average peasant the longest guaranteed rest of the year. In the countryside, the wealthier lords of the manor were expected to lay on a feast for their tenants on Christmas Day. The scale varied enormously with the lord's wealth and generosity. A modest Yorkshire knight might manage a shared meal of goose and ale, while the grander establishments served multiple courses of roasted meat, poultry, and elaborate puddings. But the principle was consistent on this one day. The barriers of class were at least partially suspended. The lord sat at his high table. The peasants ate in his hall. Everyone was fed. Everyone had more than usual. It was for people whose ordinary diet was pottage and rye bread, the most extraordinary meal of the year. One 13th century document from a Somerset manor records a specific allocation. 3 tenants were to share 2 loaves of bread, a portion of beef and bacon with mustard, 1 chicken, and as much ale as they could drink in the day. The shepherd on the same estate was entitled to a loaf of bread and a dish of meat, and his dog apparently would receive a loaf on Christmas Day. That last detail tends to make people smile, and I think it should. It speaks to something genuine about the medieval Christmas spirit, a specific practical generosity that extended at least symbolically even to the livestock. But the feasting was only one dimension of the 12 days, and probably not the most remarkable one. The celebrations that erupted across medieval England in the days between Christmas and Epiphany had an anarchic, overflowing quality that is genuinely surprising if you have been told that the Middle Ages were uniformly solemn. The same church records that document careful Advent fasting also document clergy in the days around New Year, wearing terrifying masks during services, burning old shoes, instead of incense eating black pudding at the altar, and conducting mock sermons filled with deliberate absurdity. Senior church officials gave way to junior ones. Boys were elected as boy bishops on the Feast of the Holy Innocents. On the 28th of December, a choir boy would be dressed in full vestments and preside over services while the ordained clergy stepped aside. Even Edward I of England in 1299 had a boy bishop say vespers before him. Even kings acknowledged the ritual inversion. In the village, the equivalent figure was the Lord of Misrule. The Lord of Misrule deserves a moment of real attention because he is one of the most fascinating and underappreciated characters in the whole of medieval social history. Elected for the duration of the Christmas season, sometimes by lottery, sometimes by custom, sometimes by whoever could manage to get their hands on the dried bean hidden in the 12th night cake, the Lord of Misrule was granted for 12 days the power to issue orders that could not be refused. He could make the village reeve, the Lord's enforcer, the most powerful local official in the peasant's daily life, perform ridiculous tasks. He could demand that men dress as women and women as men. He could require the priest to lead the wassailing procession. He could, in the context of the celebration, turn the social order completely upside down and make everyone play along. This is not accidental, and it is not merely fun, though it was certainly that. Historians have traced the Lord of Misrule back through the Anglo-Saxon midwinter inversions to the Roman festival of Saturnalia, during which masters served their slaves at table, and the normal hierarchies of daily life were theatrically reversed for a defined period. The function of this ritual reversal is something that anthropologists and social historians have debated at length, but the most compelling interpretation is this. The controlled temporary inversion of social order acts as a release valve for the tensions that build up in a hierarchical society over time. The peasant who must bow his head and pay his rents and hold his tongue all year gets 12 days to point and laugh at the reeve. The tension is released. The hierarchy reconstitutes itself afterward, perhaps slightly more stable for having been temporarily disrupted. It is, if you think about it, a remarkably sophisticated piece of social engineering. And it was also for the people living it very, very funny. Now, the wassail bowl, Weyes hael, be in good health. That is where the word comes from the Old Norse ves heil imported to England by the Danish settlers, who occupied significant portions of northern and eastern England through the 9th and 10th centuries. By the 13th century, the toast had become an Anglo-Saxon institution. At the beginning of the winter season, the custom dictated that the lord of the manor would greet his assembled tenants with Weyes hael, and they would respond drink hael, drink, and be healthy. The exchange marked the formal opening of the winter communal bond, but wassailing had spread well beyond the formal opening toast. By the 13th century in England, it was also a practice of going door-to-door groups of villagers, carrying a large wooden bowl of hot-spiced ale or mulled cider, going from house to house singing, wishing the household good health and a prosperous new year, and receiving in return food a coin or a replenishment of the bowl. The bowl itself was an extraordinary object in this context, warm in the hands on a freezing December night, sweet, and spiced with whatever the household had available, shared communally in a gesture that was simultaneously practical ale, was safer than water, and warmer, and deeply symbolic. What were they drinking? The recipes that survive from the period describe a combination of warmed ale or cider, honey-warming spices like cinnamon and ginger, when they could be obtained, and often eggs beaten into the mixture to enrich it. One particular version, known as lamb's wool, named for the frothy texture produced by roasted crab apples, floated on top of the drink, appears repeatedly in the records. Floating crab apples, spiced ale, warm hands around a bowl on a dark winter night. This was the precursor to what the Victorians would eventually call carolling, stripped of its rawness and given sentimental parlour songs. But the medieval original was louder, more physical, more demanding, and considerably more fun. Let me tell you something about medieval music during Christmas that tends to genuinely surprise people. The image most of us have of medieval Christmas music is either Gregorian chant, those long, pure, single-note melodies rolling through stone churches, or perhaps the kind of stately hymn that still dominates modern Christmas services. Both existed, certainly. But alongside them, and sometimes drowning them out, was a body of secular music that the church had spent considerable effort trying to suppress and never quite managed to. Medieval folk tunes for Christmas and midwinter celebrations were lively rhythmic intended for dancing, and circulated through the oral tradition without ever being written down, which is precisely why many of them survived the church's disapproval. You cannot confiscate a tune that lives only in memory. The carol, and here the word carol, means specifically a song accompanied by circle dancing. Not the sedentary Christmas hymn it later became, was a participatory communal physical event, You did not sit in a pew and listen to it, you joined hands and moved. Consider this, Good King Wenceslas, which most people think of as an authentically medieval Christmas carol, was actually written in 1853 by an English hymn writer who set new words to a 13th century springtime tune. The original tune was a summer dance melody. The medieval tradition kept getting adapted, borrowed, repurposed, but it kept surviving precisely because it answered a human need that the formal church music, however beautiful, did not. Outside in the snow, and there was often snow in Yorkshire in January, though not reliably, the children had found their own midwinter entertainments, and the calendar illustrations that medieval artists made for the months of December and January record them with evident delight. Ice skating on blades made from the polished shin bones of horses or cattle, bound to the foot with leather straps and propelled with a spiked wooden pole. Sledding down the hillsides east of the village on anything that would slide. Snowball fights depicted in a 14th century fresco from Trento, Italy, with the same gleeful mayhem that characterizes snowball fights in any era. There is something in those painted medieval snowballs that refuses to stay in the past. The children throwing them are recognizable across 700 years. Their coats are different. Their joy is identical. Adults confined more to the indoors by the cold and by the need to keep the fire going, played games that are still recognizable. Chess, which had reached England from the Arab world via the Norman conquest, and was by the 13th century widespread among people who could afford a set. Backgammon, dice. In France, the records note that even King Charles VII, who reigned in the early 15th century, was once persuaded to play dice during the Christmas celebrations. In England, the laws restricting gambling were formally suspended for the 12 days of Christmas, which tells you something about how the period was understood as a time genuinely outside the ordinary rules. Have you ever stopped to think about why we still do so many of these things? The Christmas tree, often credited to Prince Albert's German customs in the 19th century, drew on a much older tradition of bringing evergreens indoors at midwinter. William Fitzstephen, writing about 12th century London, noted that every house and every church was decorated with holly ivy bay, and whatsoever the season of the year afforded to be green. The holly, with its glossy dark leaves and red berries, had been a midwinter sacred plant since before Christianity arrived in England. The Celtic Druids considered it protective, the Romans used it as gift of goodwill at Saturnalia. The Church absorbed these traditions because it could not eliminate them, and so the holly, reframed as an allegory for the Passion of Christ, its berries, the blood and its prickles, the crown of thorns stayed on the door. It is still on the door today. The Yule log, which goes further back than almost any other midwinter tradition, was a massive piece of oak or ash brought in on Christmas Eve and kept burning symbolically through the 12 days. It was not merely decorative. In a world where keeping the fire burning was a daily physical effort and a matter of literal survival, a fire that burned continuously for 12 days, fed by the largest piece of wood the household could manage, was also a statement. We have enough. We will not go dark. We will be here in spring. That is what the Yule log meant underneath all the religious symbolism layered over it in later centuries. It meant exactly that. I want to return briefly to the moment I find most moving in the whole pageant of the medieval Christmas. Not the feast, not the wassailing, not even the Lord of Misrule in his brief ridiculous reign. It is the midnight mass. Not the theology, though the theology was real and important to the people who celebrated it. The moment itself, purely as a human experience. All the candles lit at once. The stone building, cold as a cave all winter, suddenly full of people pressed together, their breath visible in the candlelit air. The singing that was nothing like the polished church music of cathedrals, rough village voices, some of them untrained, singing the responses and the hymns from memory because most of them could not read. the priest in his vestments, the words in Latin, that many of the congregation did not understand but knew by heart, word by syllable from a lifetime of repetition, and outside the dark. The absolute unlit dark of a medieval night in December with no moon, with the stars extraordinarily bright above the frozen fields, with the village silent around the single lit building. Something happens to a community that experiences that together year after year. Something that has nothing to do with whether you believe the theology. Something about the act of gathering in the dark, in the cold, and making light together. The festival was a technology, not in the mechanical sense, in the social, deeply human sense, of a tool that a community builds and maintains to serve a necessary function. And the function it served was this: to get the people through, to spring not merely alive, but connected, alive to each other, carrying the same songs, the same fire, the same December memory from the same year together. The Feast of the Epiphany arrived on the 6th of January, and with it the formal end of the Christmas season. Plough Monday followed the first Monday after Epiphany, when the priest came to the field and blessed the plough iron, and the working year officially resumed. The Lord of Misrule went back to being whoever he was before. The music quieted, the candles were put away, and the village went back to the winter it had briefly escaped. 4 weeks more of cold. The food stores lower now by the 12 days feasting. The road still closed. The hardest stretch of January still ahead. But something had shifted in ways that are difficult to measure precisely. The people had eaten together, had sung together, had laughed at the same jokes and told the same stories, and stood in the same candlelight. The community had renewed itself the way a fire renews itself when you feed it fresh wood, not changed but burning again and able to go on, which is exactly the spirit we're going to need for what comes next. Because in the 2 months between Epiphany and Candlemas, those cold, slow post-Christmas weeks that the medieval world called the dead of winter, the village entered what I think is the least understood part of the whole season. Not the darkest, not the hungriest, but perhaps the strangest. The weeks when the children of the village disappeared from the fields and gathered instead around someone who knew things. And what they learned in those dark afternoons was how to understand the world they had been born into. That story is right ahead. There is a carved stone in the cloister of Canterbury Cathedral that most visitors walk past without noticing. It is not a saint. It is not a bishop. It is a game board, a 9 men's Morris grid scratched directly into the stone bench by a child's hand sometime in the 13th century, when the child was supposed to be sitting quietly during a sermon. That child is 800 years dead. The game board is still there. I find myself thinking about that carving more than almost any other piece of medieval evidence I've ever come across, because it is so completely recognizably human. The theology, the politics, the famines and plagues and dynastic wars of the medieval period, those things have weight and consequence and importance. But a bored child secretly scratching a game into a stone bench, that is a window that opens straight through the centuries without any interpretation required. The children of our Yorkshire village were in the winter simultaneously the most vulnerable members of the community and among its most energetic. The statistics of medieval childhood mortality are sober enough to require a moment of honest acknowledgement before we go any further. Historians estimate that roughly 25% of children born in medieval England did not survive their first year. Another 12% died between the ages of 1 and 4. By the time a child reached the age of 7, the age at which medieval canon law considered a child capable of moral reasoning, the age at which formal responsibilities began, they had already run a statistical gauntlet that modern parents in the developed world simply do not have a frame of reference for. Winter was where those statistics showed most clearly. Infant mortality was demonstrably higher in the cold months, partly from exposure, partly from the respiratory infections that swept through households crowded around smoky fires, and partly from the simple reality that a mother who was herself malnourished and cold produced less milk of lower quality, and an infant is the first to feel that deficit. The coroner's records that survive from 13th and 14th century English villages record with the matter-of-fact brevity that is somehow more affecting than any amount of lamentation would be the winter deaths of small children. Found cold. Fell from the arms of a servant into the fire. The infant was not nourished. These are small sentences carrying enormous weight. But here is the other side of the ledger, the side that historians sometimes underplay because it does not fit easily into the dominant narrative of medieval suffering. The children who survived were by every account available genuinely loved. The old claim articulated most influentially by the French historian Philippe Ariès in the 20th century, and repeated for decades afterward, as though it were established fact that medieval parents did not form emotional attachments to young children, because mortality rates made such attachment too painful, has been convincingly dismantled by modern scholarship. Nicholas Orme, in his landmark study of medieval English childhood, draws on an enormous range of sources, wills, literary texts, court records, archaeological evidence to demonstrate that medieval parents grieved their children's deaths with the same depth and particularity that parents grieve them now. The love was real. The loss was real. The high mortality rate did not make the individual child less precious. If anything, it made every surviving winter more significant. 7 years old was in the medieval understanding of childhood a genuine threshold. Before 7, the age of reason, as the Church called it, a child was thought to be morally incomplete, incapable of sin in the full sense, not yet fully responsible for their actions. After 7, the world began to make demands, and in a peasant village those demands were quite specific. By 7 or 8, a child in our Yorkshire village was doing real work. Not symbolic, light, carefully supervised work. Real work with real consequences if it was not done. Tending geese or chickens which required being outside for hours in cold, that their small bodies handled less well than adults. Collecting eggs, carrying water, scaring birds from the stored grain in the barn, watching the youngest siblings while the parents worked. Gathering firewood from the edge of the forest. A task that coroners' records reveal was the source of a disproportionate number of childhood accidents. Children crushed by falling timber, drowned in frozen streams that cracked beneath them, struck by branches in storms. These are not happy details, but they are honest ones, and I think they are important to hold alongside the image of the playing child, because the playing child and the working child were the same child, and the medieval village did not artificially separate those two aspects of childhood the way that industrial modernity eventually would. What they did in the gaps between the work is frankly delightful. William Fitzstephen, the 12th century London chronicler, wrote one of the most vivid descriptions of medieval winter childhood activities that survives. He describes with obvious pleasure the children who took to the frozen Thames on skates made from animal bones, horse leg bones smoothed and polished on one side strapped to the foot, with leather thongs pushed forward with an iron-tipped pole held in both hands. Fitzstephen notes with the slightly pained accuracy of a man who'd observed this sport closely, that when one skater collided with another, one or both fall not without bodily hurt, and wherever the ice touches the head it scrapes and skins it entirely. This is the medieval equivalent of a parental warning label, and the children, one assumes, ignored it with exactly the same cheerful indifference with which children have always ignored parental warning labels. The bone skates were not imaginary. At Coppergate in York, archaeologists excavated 42 pairs of Viking-era ice skates made from horse metapodials, the long bones of the lower leg. They'd been cut flat, polished, smooth, and drilled with a hole at one end for a leather strap. The oily exterior surface of the animal bone acted, researchers discovered, as a natural lubricant on the ice, reducing resistance in a way that made these improvised skates surprisingly effective. In the village where the mill pond froze solid every year by mid-December, the same principle applied. A horse died. You used the bones. Nothing was wasted, and on a bright January morning the children had transportation. There is a question I want to ask you, and I want you to actually think about it rather than just letting it wash past. What did you learn that was genuinely important to you? Not from a teacher, not from a book, not from a screen, but from being with an older person who knew something you needed to know, because in the medieval village that was the primary mechanism of education for almost everyone under 14. Not school, not a curriculum, not a formal institution, an older person and a skill and time together. The village children, once past the age of 7, were apprentices in the most original sense of the word, not yet bound by formal contracts, but learning by proximity and repetition the things that their survival would require. A boy helped his father mend the ploughshare and learned which grain of wood was strongest in each type of timber. A girl sat beside her mother and learned to card wool before she learned to spin it, and learned to spin it before she learned to weave in an ordered progression of skill that began with the coarsest and least demanding work, and graduated year by year toward the more refined. She watched Edith the village healer, and learned which bundles of dried herbs were which, and how much of which went into the pot and how long the pot boiled. Not because anyone told her she was being trained, simply because she was there. Winter was when this transmission happened most intensively. During the growing season, children worked outdoors and worked hard, and there was less opportunity for the kind of sustained close indoor tutelage that winter permitted. But in the cold months, huddled around the fire, working alongside the adults at the indoor tasks, the spinning, the mending, the woodwork, the food preparation, children absorbed everything they were shown, and a good deal that they were not explicitly shown but simply watched. The historian Barbara Hannawalt, whose work on medieval English peasant families drew extensively on coroners' records and manorial accounts, made an observation that I think is one of the most quietly profound things I have ever read about childhood and learning. She noted that medieval children were not separated from adult life in the way that modern children are. They were present for births and deaths, for slaughter and illness, for the full cycle of agricultural and domestic work from the earliest age. The consequence of this was not, she argued, a premature loss of innocence, but a different kind of knowledge, a knowledge of how things actually worked, obtained first-hand, that modern children rarely have access to. A medieval child of 10 who had helped birth a calf watched a pig slaughtered, sat with a dying grandparent, and preserved food for winter, had a working model of life and death that was both more accurate and more grounded than anything taught in a formal institution. It is a complicated observation, and I do not want to romanticize it. The exposure to loss and hardship in medieval childhood was real, and the adult mortality that surrounded these children was genuinely traumatic in ways we can only partially appreciate. But there is something in Hannawalt's point that resists easy dismissal. A childhood spent as a genuine participant in the life of a community is a different kind of childhood than one spent in carefully managed age-segregated environments. Not necessarily better, different in ways that matter. Outside, when the work was done and the weather permitted, the village children played with an energy and inventiveness that the archaeological record captures in unexpected ways. Hundreds of medieval children's toys have been recovered from excavations in London alone over the past several decades. Clay marbles, perfect spheres fired in kilns, Miniature pottery, tiny replicas of the household cooking vessels in the same shapes and the same clay as the full-sized versions. Wooden soldiers lead-weighted at the base so they stood upright. A puppet found at Wimbledon in Cambridgeshire, its cloth body long decayed, but the clay head and hands still intact with holes showing where strings had once run. These objects are not catalogued by their makers' names, but the tiny fingerprints that archaeologists have found pressed into the clay of some of these pieces before they were fired, fingerprints so small they could only belong to a child of 4 or 5, are in their way more personal than any name. The games the older children played in winter were physical, noisy, and occasionally alarming to bystanders. A game called Hot Cockles, which involved one player kneeling blindfolded while others struck them and they tried to guess who had hit them, appears in multiple manuscript illustrations and was apparently beloved of children and bewildering to anyone who watched. 9 men's Morris scratched onto the bench at Canterbury, and on similar benches at Salisbury Cathedral was a strategy game of genuine complexity, the medieval equivalent of chess for those who lacked a chess set. Knucklebones, a game involving tossing and catching the small bones of sheep feet known today as jacks, was documented in England from at least the 12th century and probably much earlier, and in the snow, when the snow was deep enough, there were snowball fights depicted in a 14th century fresco from the castle of Buonconsiglio in Trento, Italy, with a vividness and a joy that needed no translation across the 6 centuries between the image and my eyes. Children in heavy wool cloaks, an arm drawn back, a snowball already in flight, someone very definitely about to be hit. The Candlemas children occupy a particular place in the story of the medieval winter, and I want to talk about them for a moment. The children born in late September, October and early November, those most likely to have been conceived during the dark, close communal winter months, entered the world at the exact moment the village was beginning its most intense period of indoor closeness. As the historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie observed in his study of the medieval village cycle, the demographics of medieval birth records show a consistent pattern. Births clustered in autumn and early winter, pointing to conception in the preceding January, February and the dark heart of December. The long nights of midwinter, it turns out, were not only cold. The babies of Candlemas came in the first days of February into a world just beginning to warm, born into a village that had survived with whatever gaps in it the winter had made, and that now had new members, new voices in the smoky dark of the longhouse, new weight in someone's arms. I want to close this chapter with one specific image that I think carries everything we have been saying about medieval childhood in it. In the archives at the British Library, in a manuscript produced in England around the year 1310, there is an illuminated calendar page for the month of January. It shows a family inside their home. The fire is burning. The adults are at their work, the woman spinning, the man repairing something. The details of their tasks rendered with the kind of attentive specificity that medieval illuminators brought to the material world. And there at the lower edge of the image, almost as an afterthought, is a child. The child is sitting very close to the fire. The child has a small clay pot and is doing something with it, playing or helping. The line is not clear. The child's face is turned toward the fire, and the firelight catches it, and the expression is entirely absorbed, entirely present in whatever small thing the child is doing with the clay. It is an ordinary moment. It is 700 years old, and it is somehow completely familiar. The children of the frieze grew up, if they were lucky, into the adults of the spring. And those adults faced one more thing about the medieval winter that we have circled around but not yet looked at directly, the question of what lived in the darkness outside the village, the question of what was out there in the forest when the last fire went low, the question that every adult in that Yorkshire village had answered for themselves privately and never entirely stopped wondering about. That question brings us to the edge of the trees and to the most ancient fear in the medieval winter imagination. At the edge of every medieval village in England there was a boundary. Sometimes it was a ditch, sometimes a low earthen bank grown over with bramble, sometimes nothing more visible than the last row of cottage gardens where the tended ground gave way to rough grass, and then beyond that the darkness of the trees. On one side of that boundary hearth fire pottage the sound of children, the smell of animals, community, the known world, on the other side the forest. And in winter, when the fire was low and the darkness pressed close and the wind moved through the bare branches in ways that did not always sound like wind, the forest was something the village thought about, something the village told stories about in the particular way that people who live very close to an actual danger eventually develop a mythology to contain it. Those stories are worth listening to, not because they are true in the literal sense, because of what they reveal about what it felt like to live at the edge of the wild in the coldest and darkest months of the year, without any light between you and whatever was out there. Let us start with the wolves, because the wolves were real. In England of the 13th century, wolves still inhabited the northern uplands and forested valleys in numbers that modern estimates drawn from manorial accounts and hunting records suggest were sufficient to make them a genuine and recurrent problem for livestock farmers. They were not the catastrophic plague of legend Hollywood has done considerable damage to the medieval wolf's reputation, but they were present, they were hungry in winter, and they were bold enough in the lean months to come within range of villages that they would have avoided in summer. The Anglo-Saxon calendar had named January Wolf Month Wolf Month as far back as anyone could remember, not as metaphor, as practical description. January was the month when wolves driven by hunger came closest to human settlement. The hunting season for wolves was formally designated to run from January through the 25th of March, when the wolf cubs were born and the animals were most vulnerable. This was not a coincidence of the calendar. It was a practical response to a practical reality. The coldest, most food-depleted part of the year was also the time when wolves were most dangerous to the livestock that represented so much of a village's wealth. By the time of King John in the early 13th century, not a king celebrated for generosity, in most respects the crown was offering a reward of 5 shillings for each wolf pelt submitted. 5 shillings was roughly 5 days' wages for a skilled labourer. The bounty was not trivial, and in northern England, particularly in the uplands of Yorkshire and Northumberland, the wolf remained a real presence well into the 13th century. The monk Galfrid, writing of Northumberland, observed that wolves were so numerous in his region that it was nearly impossible for shepherds to adequately protect their flocks. Here is what I find genuinely fascinating about the medieval English wolf, though, once you get past the fear. The wolf in England was by the late 13th century in the early stages of its long decline toward extinction. Woodland clearance driven by the expanding agricultural economy that the population growth of the 12th and 13th centuries demanded was progressively reducing wolf habitat. Hunting pressure was intensifying. By the end of the 14th century, wolves in southern England were effectively gone. By the time Henry VII was on the throne, the last wolves in England had been killed most likely somewhere in the north. So in our village in 1280, the wolves that the children heard about in the fireside stories, the wolves that the shepherd worried about when the flock was out past dark, the wolves that Agnes thought about when the dog barked 3 times and then went quiet. These were among the last generations of wolves to inhabit England. The animal that had shaped the fear and folklore and practical management of the English rural winter for centuries was without anyone knowing it disappearing. The stories would outlast the creatures they described by 500 years. There is something melancholy in that if you let yourself feel it. The wolf was gone long before anyone noticed it was gone. But the forest at the edge of the village was not only about wolves. The wolves were the part you could point to, name track through the snow and deal with practically. The other part was harder to name. In the medieval imagination, and here I am speaking not of the Church's official theology, carefully worked out in cathedral schools and university disputations, but of the living mental world of ordinary people in ordinary villages. The boundary between the settled and the wild was also the boundary between the ordered and the unknown, between the world that obeyed familiar rules and the world that did not. The forest was where things happened that the village could not explain and had learned over generations not to fully investigate. This is the world that produced the stories, and some of them, the ones that survived in folklore long enough to be written down, give us a remarkable window into what that anxiety actually felt like from the inside. The Wild Hunt is the oldest and most persistent of these stories, and it belongs specifically to winter. In the folk tradition of northern and western England, inherited from the Scandinavian settlers who had occupied these regions in the 9th and 10th centuries, the Wild Hunt was a procession of riders that moved through the winter sky on the darkest and stormiest nights. Black horses, black hounds with eyes that glowed in the dark, horns blowing in the distance, then closer, then suddenly, very close indeed. The leader varied by region, sometimes a cursed king, sometimes a hunter condemned to ride forever, sometimes a figure whose name was not spoken at all. The advice passed through the generations with the same seriousness as agricultural knowledge was unambiguous. If you were outside when the hunt passed, you got down on the ground, and you kept your eyes down, and you did not look up until the sound had faded. The Peterborough Chronicle, a continuation of the Anglo-Saxon chronicle maintained by monks at Peterborough Abbey, records under the year 1127 an event that its author clearly believed to be the Wild Hunt made manifest. The entry describes the arrival of an unpopular new abbot, a man called Henry of Poitou, whom the monks regarded as grasping and corrupt, and then it records what happened in the woods around the abbey in the weeks after his arrival. Many men both saw and heard a great number of huntsmen hunting. The huntsmen were black, huge and hideous, and rode on black horses and on black he-goats, and their hounds were jet black with eyes like saucers and horrible. This was seen in the very deer park of the town of Peterborough, and in all the woods that stretch from that same town to Stamford, and in the night the monks heard them sounding and winding their horns. This entry is recorded in an official chronicle written by an educated monk intended to document the history of a major English abbey for posterity. The writer does not hedge it or frame it as rumour. He records it as a witnessed fact in the same tone he uses to record floods and fires and royal deaths. About 20 or 30 horn-blowers were counted by those who heard them. The sightings continued from Lent through Easter, a period of roughly 6 weeks. What did they actually see and hear? Modern interpretations range widely in migrating geese, whose calls in the dark genuinely do sound like dogs baying. A storm moving through trees, and interpreted through a framework already primed to find the Wild Hunt in winter weather. Deliberate social performance by people who wanted to express symbolically and safely their displeasure with the new abbot. The historian Ronald Hutton, who has studied these accounts extensively, suggests that the Wild Hunt in medieval England was not a unified myth, but a cluster of related anxieties about the dead, about the wilderness, about the unpredictability of the night that coalesced differently in different places and contexts. What is undeniable is that the people of Peterborough in 1127 experienced something they understood as the Wild Hunt, and that this experience was real to them in every way that mattered. The monks did not sleep well those nights. The chronicle proves it. Closer to the ground level of village life, the winter fears were more domestic in scale but no less real in their hold on people's imagination. The werewolf, in Old English literally man-wolf, was considered seriously enough in medieval England that King Nut's early 11th century law codes include provisions concerning it. Gervase of Tilbury, An English scholar writing in the early 13th century stated with considerable calm that, "In England we've often seen men change into wolves." He's not reporting a rumour. He's stating what he regards as a fact within the natural order as unremarkable as the behaviour of tides or the patterns of the weather. I want to be precise about what this means because it is easy to hear it as simple superstition and miss the more interesting thing going on. The medieval understanding of the werewolf was not the Hollywood version, the involuntary transformation under a full moon, the silver bullet. It was more philosophically complex. The primary concern of the Church, working from a framework inherited from Roman theology, was with the question of whether physical transformation was possible at all. The dominant Church position held that it was not shape-shifting was impossible, except by divine will, and those who claimed to witness it were either deceived by demonic illusion or suffering from a disorder of the imagination. What the Church was essentially saying was the wolf you think you saw in the forest at midnight was probably a wolf, but your terror of it may have told you something true about the nature of the darkness. I think a lot about what it meant practically and emotionally to live at that boundary. Modern people in the developed world do not live at the edge of the wild in any way that is comparable. The closest most of us come is a camping trip where the nearest town is 30 minutes away by car, and even that carries a phone signal and a clear path home. The darkness in a rural medieval winter was absolute in a way that has no modern equivalent outside of deliberate experience. No street lights, no reflected glow from a distant city. On a cloudy night in January in a Yorkshire valley with no moon, you could not see your hand in front of your face outside your door. The sounds of the forest, and there were many of them, the nocturnal sounds of a living ecosystem that has not been managed for human comfort, were not romantic backdrop. They were the auditory texture of an environment where things that could harm you actually lived. In that context, the boundary between the village and the forest was not a metaphor. It was a practical line of safety maintained by fire and familiarity, and the accumulated knowledge of where things were in the dark. To cross it at night in winter without good reason was not romantic adventure. It was a decision with real consequences, and the stories, the wild hunt, the werewolf, the nameless things that the old woman at the end of the lane told the children never to look for in the forest. After dark, these stories were not mere entertainment. They were the village's collective intelligence about the boundary compressed into narrative form and passed through the generations. Stay close to the fire. Do not go into the forest at night. If you hear horns in the dark, get down and wait. This is in the most fundamental sense useful knowledge. And it was kept alive in the medium that has always kept useful knowledge alive story. Have you ever noticed how the things we're most afraid of tend to live at the edges? The edge of the light, the edge of the map, the edge of what we understand. The medieval villager standing at his door on a winter night listening to the forest, and the modern person lying awake at 3 a.m. thinking about something they cannot name. There is more connection between those two experiences than the centuries between them might suggest. The forest at the edge of the village was the medieval winter's most honest metaphor for the part of life that cannot be controlled or fully known. It was where the harvest could not follow you, where the fire's warmth did not reach, where the rules that governed the village, who owed what to whom, what the Lord could demand, what the priest could forgive, simply did not apply. And in January, when the cold was at its depth, and the food stores were past their midpoint, and the days were still short, and the road was still closed, the forest was right there. Not far, not abstract, just beyond the last garden, breathing in the dark. Here is the thing, though, that I always want to say at this point in the story, because I think it matters enormously. The village people were not only afraid, they were also practical. The forest was feared, yes. It was also harvested. Pannage rites in autumn, firewood collection in winter, mushroom gathering. In autumn charcoal production, timber felling under the Lord's licenses, the gathering of medicinal herbs in summer, the forest was a resource as much as a threat, and the people of the village navigated it daily with the particular combination of respect and confidence that comes from genuine knowledge. They knew the forest the way they knew the cold, not as an abstraction, but as a specific landscape with specific behaviours mapped by generations of observation. The wild hunt came and people got off the road and waited. And then it passed and they got up and they went home, and in the morning they went back into the forest for firewood. That is the medieval winter in miniature fear and practicality walking together through the snow. What the darkness at the edge of the village ultimately gave the community was something that the warmth and brightness of the Christmas feasting could not by itself provide. It gave them each other, because the fire meant nothing without the darkness around it. The stories were nothing without the listeners pressed together to hear them. The wassail bowl passed more readily, when the alternative to taking it was being alone at the edge of the tree line in the dark, and so the winter village in its deepest and most honest form was a community defined by its boundary, defined by what it was not, defined by the dark. In the last few weeks before the thaw, something important happened in the village that brought these two worlds, the warm inside and the dark outside, into a particular charged relationship. A relationship that the village had been managing with varying degrees of success for as long as anyone alive could remember. It has to do with the tension between two households in the village, the Lord's Hall and the peasant's hearth, and what winter did to that tension when the road was closed, and there was nowhere for either party to go. That story is next. Two fires burning tonight in our Yorkshire Valley. One in a longhouse on the village lane, Agnes and Thomas and their children, the pottage pot, the tallow candle stub, the spindle resting against the wall where it was left when the light finally gave out. Another fire perhaps half a mile away in the great hall of the manor house, a fire so large it requires a grown man to manage it, burning seasoned oak in a fireplace built into a stone wall, with tapestries hung on every side to keep the heat from bleeding out through the stone, and on the table nearby 3 kinds of roasted meat wine from Gascony in southern France, and enough beeswax candles to make the whole room glow gold. The distance between those two fires, not in yards but in every other meaningful sense, is what this part of the story's about. The medieval English class system has been described in many ways by many historians with varying degrees of sympathy for the various parties. But there is one description that cuts through the abstraction more cleanly than most, and it comes not from a historian but from a medieval preacher. In the late 13th century, English sermons frequently organised society into 3 orders: those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. The ones who work were in theory provided with protection by the fighters and spiritual guidance by the prayers. In practice, of course, they also provided almost everything that both of the other categories consumed. The equation was not supposed to feel as lopsided as it actually was. And in winter, when the road was closed and the options narrowed and the village was essentially sealed inside its own boundaries, the lopsidedness was impossible to ignore. Let us be precise about what a typical villain and unfree peasant, which is what most of the people in our Yorkshire village were, actually owed his lord. Not in vague terms, in specific enumerated obligations that the manorial courts recorded with the particular obsessive precision of institutions that understood exactly where the money was. Under the customary arrangements documented in thousands of surviving 13th century manorial rolls, a villain holding a standard vejete of land roughly 20 to 30 acres, theoretically sufficient to support a family, owed his lord somewhere between 2 and 3 days of labour per week throughout the year, plus additional boon work during harvest time, when the labour requirement could increase dramatically. He paid a tallage and annual tax at whatever rate his lord chose to assess, because the lord's right to tallage his villeins at will was one of the defining characteristics of unfree tenure. He paid merchant if he wanted his daughter to marry a fee for permission to give away his own child to another household. He paid Heriot when he died the best beast in the household handed over to the lord before the family could inherit anything else. And he ground his grain at the lord's mill, where the miller took a portion called multure as payment, because using any other mill was not permitted. In the 100 Rolls of 1279, King Edward I's great survey of English landholding conducted in the same decade as our story, these obligations were recorded for hundreds of manors across 4 Midland counties. The rolls show a pattern that is both consistent and sobering. The peasants of Ricote in Oxfordshire, whose rents had been raised by their lord, used the survey as an opportunity to formally protest, setting out in careful detail the customary obligations they believed they actually owed, which were considerably less than what they were being charged. They had done their legal homework, they knew their rights. They also clearly knew that their lord had been violating them. Here is what I find myself wanting to say about the medieval class system, having spent considerable time inside the records of it. It was not simply brutal, it was complicated in ways that complicate our sympathy in both directions. The lord of the manor was not in most cases, in most places in this period, a cartoon villain who sat in his hall indifferent to the suffering of his tenants. He was a man with his own obligations upward to the baron above him, and ultimately to the king, and his own anxieties about status and debt, and the endless expense of maintaining a military household. He was also in many documented cases genuinely invested in the welfare of his tenants, not from pure altruism, but from the very practical understanding that dead or starving peasants did not pay rents or work fields, and that a village in collapse was a lord's economic catastrophe as much as anyone else's. But the system had a structural problem that no amount of individual goodwill could fully remedy. The obligations ran in one direction. The labour and the rent and the tallage and the merchant went up from villain to lord reliably, and regardless of circumstances. What came back down? Protection, justice, access to the mill and the oven and the common pasture was real, but it was discretionary in a way that the obligations were not. A lord could choose to waive a tallage in a bad year. He was not required to. A lord could distribute food to his tenants in a winter of shortage. Most did not, at least not consistently. This safety net existed at the lord's pleasure. The obligations existed regardless, and in winter when the food stores were running thin and the cold was pressing in, and there was no road and no market and no alternative in winter, that asymmetry was at its most visible. The manor house itself, if you walked up to it on a January afternoon and looked at it from the outside, was not obviously opulent. It was stone, which was more expensive than timber and thatch, but not itself a mark of luxury. It was large by village standards, but a small manor house in 13th century Yorkshire might not be much larger in floor area than a prosperous modern bungalow. What distinguished it from the long house down the lane was not size, so much as specificity of function. There was a hall for eating and conducting manorial business. There was a solar, the private chamber where the lord's family slept, which by the 13th century increasingly had its own fireplace, a luxury that the village longhouse almost never possessed. There was a kitchen separated from the main building to reduce fire risk. There was almost certainly a chapel, and there was warmth. Genuine, sustained structural warmth of a kind the villain's longhouse could not match however many animals you crowded into it. The stone fireplaces of the manor burning seasoned hardwood, rather than green or damp branches with chimney flues designed to draw efficiently, kept the hall at a temperature that is recognizable to modern sensibilities as merely cold rather than dangerously cold. The solar, smaller and better insulated by tapestries and fur bed coverings, was genuinely comfortable by medieval standards. English sumptuary laws of the period regulated with the particular precision of a system deeply invested in visible social hierarchy, who was permitted to wear what. In 1363, a formal law somewhat late for our story, but reflecting arrangements that had been customary much earlier, specified that common people could line their winter clothing only with lamb, rabbit, cat and fox fur. The finer fur squirrel, which could add 2 to 3 pounds to the cost of a single garment, ermine sable, were for the nobility and the wealthy. The distinction was not merely aesthetic, it was functional. Ermine and sable actually kept you warmer than rabbit. These sumptuary laws were simultaneously a statement of social hierarchy and a literal allocation of warmth. Those at the top were permitted to be more comfortable. The law said so. Think about that for a moment, because I think it is one of the starkest things I know about the medieval world. Not only was inequality present, it was written into law that the poor must be less warm. Now, the manorial court was the formal institution where the tensions between lord and tenant were supposed to be managed, and it is worth spending a little time here because the court records reveal a social dynamic that is considerably more complex than a simple story of oppression and suffering. The court met several times a year, presided over by the lord or his steward, attended by the tenants of the manor, who were required by law to show up. The legal term was suit of court, and failing to attend without good reason meant a fine. The court heard disputes between tenants, regulated the use of common resources like the pasture and the mill, enforced the labour obligations, and dealt with the minor lawsuits and complaints that accumulated in any community living at close quarters. What the court records reveal is that peasants used the court actively and intelligently. They sued each other. They sued cautiously, and with considerable strategic care their lords, or rather they used the machinery of custom to constrain their lords, citing precedent and tradition, and the recorded obligations of previous generations to resist demands that exceeded what was customarily owed. The peasants of Ricote, whom we met earlier, were doing exactly this. They were not helpless. They were disadvantaged in a system that was structurally weighted against them, and they worked within it with the tenacity of people who understood that the custom was often the only protection they had. There was a particular feature of villanage that the legal historians find fascinating, and that I think illuminates the whole relationship in a single image. A villain was legally described as owning nothing of his own that could not be taken by his lord. Everything he possessed, tools, animals stored grain, the contents of his house was technically the lord's property held at the lord's sufferance. And yet, the court records of the 13th century are full of cases in which lords did not in fact seize their villain's property. The legal right existed. The practice was considerably more restrained, because a lord who exercised every legal right he possessed consistently and without restraint ended up with a village of empty houses and nobody to work his fields. The system sustained itself through a negotiated friction. The lord had the power legally. The peasant had the leverage of his own labour. Each needed the other in ways that neither had chosen and neither entirely admitted. Winter stripped away every layer of comfortable abstraction from this arrangement and exposed the bones of it. In summer, the lord was visible primarily as an obligation the days of labour owed on his fields, the mill fee, the tallage assessment. He was present but not constantly proximate. But in winter, with the village sealed in, and the outdoor work suspended, and the whole community contracted into its narrow indoor life, the gap between the manor house and the longhouse became something that was simply there daily and impossible to ignore. The smell of roasting meat from the manor kitchen drifted down the lane. The beeswax candles in the manor windows visible from outside on a dark January evening, as a warm, bright smear of light against the stone were a visible daily reminder of what the difference in status actually meant in terms of warmth and light and food. The manorial court records from January and February deep winter, the thin months show a spike in certain categories of dispute: theft of grain and firewood, disputes over common pasture rights, cases of timber taken from the Lord's forest illegally. These are not the records of people committing crimes for sport. They are the records of people making desperate decisions when the arithmetic of survival did not add up. One Yorkshire manorial record from the late 13th century, the Wakefield Court Rolls, which are the longest continuous run of manorial records for any single manor in England, running from medieval times well into later centuries, records a case in which a man was fined for taking without leave a cartload of dead wood from the Lord's forest in February. He paid the fine. The record does not tell us whether he had hungry children or a failing fire or simply a cold he could not shake. The record never tells us that. It only tells us what he took and what it cost him. Here is the thing about that fine that I keep returning to because I think it contains something important. He paid it. He did not starve. He took the wood, kept his family warm through February, paid the fine in spring and went on. The system absorbed the transgression, extracted its price and continued. This is how the medieval village actually worked, not as a clean and stable hierarchy of perfectly observed obligations, but as a living system of constant small negotiations, violations and adjustments, in which both sides had interests and both sides pushed back, and the whole thing creaked along through the seasons by means of a constant, exhausting management of mutual need. The Lord needed his villeins to be alive and functional in spring. The villeins needed the Lord's protection and access to the mill and the common land. Both of these needs were real. Neither entirely obscured the other, and in the long, cold, closed-off weeks of the Yorkshire winter, they sat with that reality in close proximity, unable to pretend otherwise. Something shifted over the course of the 13th century in the balance of this relationship. Not dramatically, not yet. That drama would come in the 14th century in the catastrophic years of the Great Famine between 1315 and 1322, and then the Black Death of 1348, both of which broke the population and the social arrangements of medieval England in ways from which they never fully recovered. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was the eventual consequence of a century of accumulated pressure, but in the 1280s of our story, the pressure was already building. Population had been growing for over a century, pressing against the limits of available agricultural land. The marginal plots were being brought into cultivation. We saw hints of this in the per presture cases, the illegal clearings at the edge of the forest. Holdings were being subdivided between sons until a family's land was too small to sustain them adequately. The winter food calculations, which had been tight but manageable for a generation, were getting tighter, and the Lord's demands, which had been customary and relatively stable for decades, were in some places beginning to press upward. The village was not at the breaking point, but the breaking point was not entirely invisible from where they stood. What did Agnes know about all of this? What did Thomas know, fixing the plough handle in the January dark with the beeswax glow of the manor windows faintly visible through the gap in the thatch? They knew what they needed to know. They knew the custom. They knew what was owed. They knew with the particular clarity of people who had been watching the same system their entire lives, the difference between a lord who respected the custom and one who did not, and they knew which kind they had. They knew in the specific and granular way of people who have never been able to afford not to pay attention every detail of the arrangement they lived inside. And they also, this is the part I think matters most, they also knew that February was almost over, that the ground was beginning to soften, that Candlemas was coming with its candles and its promise of returning warmth, and that beyond it, only weeks away now, was the moment when the road would open again and the world would expand. They were almost through, and what waited for them on the other side of winter, not the Lord's Hall and not the wolves in the forest, and not the calculations of hunger, but something quieter and more personal, is the story we have been saving for last. Because the village that came out of the winter was not exactly the same village that had gone into it. Something had happened in those long dark months of closeness and difficulty and occasional unexpected grace. Something that is harder to measure than grain stores or court fines, but no less real. The village had become more itself, and the people in it had become more themselves. That transformation is where we are going next. Somewhere between part 10 and part 12 of anything, there is a particular temptation to start wrapping things up to begin the long, gentle landing. I am going to resist that temptation for a little while longer, because there is something here that deserves its own space. Something about what happens to the human mind when it is sealed inside for months with the same small group of people it has known its entire life in the dark, with limited food and no outside news and nothing to distract it from itself. This is the part of the medieval winter that the history books most often miss. Not the cold, not the hunger, not even the wolves. What I mean is the interior life of it. The way that 4 months of enforced proximity and reduced stimulation shaped not just the bodies but the minds, the relationships and the stories of the people who lived through it. Let us begin with something that sounds trivial but is not gossip. Gossip has a bad reputation, partly because the word has been feminized and therefore diminished in the medieval period. The word itself originally meant godparent, someone in a close spiritual relationship with you, and only gradually came to mean a female friend and then a woman who talked too much. But the thing the word describes the circulation of social information within a community was, and arguably remains, one of the most important mechanisms of social regulation that human beings have ever developed. In the medieval village sealed off from the outside world for 4 months, gossip did not diminish. It intensified. It had to. Because in a closed system where every household was dependent on every other household, the management of social information, who was doing what, who owed what to whom, whether the widow at the end of the lane was actually managing or quietly failing, whether the reeve had been taking more than his share at the mill, whether the couple 2 doors down were having the kind of trouble that might eventually require the village to take sides. This information was not merely interesting, it was essential. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar, whose work on social cognition in the 1990s, proposed what has come to be called Dunbar's number, the hypothesis that the human brain can maintain genuine social relationships with roughly 150 people, observed that language evolved primarily as a mechanism for social grooming. The primate behavior of alliance building through physical contact scaled up, to allow much larger groups to stay socially coherent without requiring everyone to groom everyone else physically. His name for this was grooming talk. Another word for it is gossip. In the medieval village of 40 households and 200 people, gossip was not a failure of character. It was the system working correctly. Now the gossip existed alongside something richer and more deliberate. Winter evenings, once the work was done and the candle had been lit and the children were in some intermediate state between playing and sleeping, were the primary medium for the transmission of everything the village knew, not through formal instruction, through story. The oral tradition of medieval England was not a quaint survival from a simpler time. It was a sophisticated, actively maintained technology for the preservation and transmission of knowledge, belief and identity across generations that did not read and write. In a community where perhaps 5 to 10% of men, and even fewer women, had any functional literacy, everything that needed to be remembered, legal customs, agricultural practice, medicinal knowledge, moral codes, the genealogy of local families, the stories of the saints, the history of the village and its landscape, was stored not in books but in people. In specific people who'd been listening carefully for a long time. The best of these people were not necessarily the oldest. They were the most attentive, the ones who remembered details, the ones who could hold a long story together from one telling to the next and give it shape without writing a word. These were not professional storytellers in the troubadour sense that figure belonged to courts and great houses. They were ordinary men and women who happened to have a gift for keeping things alive in the memory and passing them on. What did they tell? The stories that circulated in medieval English villages are recoverable in fragments and echoes through several routes. The folklore collections of later centuries preserve some of the oldest surviving versions. The medieval fabliaux, short comic tales, earthy and often bawdy, widely circulated in 13th century France, and England preserved the sensibility of popular storytelling, even if they were eventually written down by literate hands. The saints' lives and miracle stories that the church promoted were in their oral village versions considerably more dramatic and stranger than their official written forms. And the ballads, the long-sung narrative poems that circulated through northern England in the medieval period and were eventually collected by Francis James Child in the 19th century preserve, in their structure and their concerns, the traces of a storytelling tradition that goes back further than the Norman conquest. What the stories shared across their enormous variety of subject and tone was a preoccupation with the things that most deeply concerned the people who told them: justice and its absence, the reversal of fortunes, the small person who outwitted the powerful one, the faithful woman whose patience was eventually rewarded, the husband who came home after years away and found everything changed and had to find his way back in, the widow who was cheated of what was owed her and found an unexpected ally. These are not sophisticated literary themes. They are the themes of people living close to the edge of what is manageable in a world where the powerful had structural advantages and the only remedies available were cleverness, patience, and community solidarity. The stories encoded the community's values the same way the manorial court encoded its obligations, not perfectly, not without contradiction, but persistently. Generation after generation, the same stories came back, adapted to new names and new circumstances, carrying the same core of moral and practical intelligence forward. Here is something I want to offer you as a thought, because I think it is genuinely surprising once you sit with it. The medieval peasant sealed in his longhouse on a January evening with his neighbours listening to a story told by the firelight was engaged in something that modern neuroscience now recognises as one of the most cognitively and socially complex activities human beings perform. Story listening activates more regions of the brain simultaneously than almost any other activity. The narrative processing networks, the social cognition networks, the emotional regulation systems, the memory consolidation processes that occur during and after an engaging story. It is not passive entertainment. It is from the brain's perspective an enormously active form of social rehearsal, running through scenarios, imagining perspectives, practicing emotional responses in a context that feels safe because it is fictional. The medieval winter evening was from this perspective not merely a way of passing the time. It was a sustained communal exercise in the kind of social cognition that kept a community functional. The story about the widow who was cheated was not only a story. It was a rehearsal for how everyone in the room would behave and would expect others to behave if such a situation arose. The story about the small man who outwitted the Lord was not only satisfying entertainment, it was an assertion of possibility, a reminder that cleverness and solidarity were real tools available to people with nothing else. The psychological weight of the winter deserves direct attention. because it tends to be either sentimentalized or minimized, and neither does it justice. In the medieval theological vocabulary, the condition that winter brought on or intensified was called acedia. The word comes from Greek via the desert fathers of early Christian monasticism, and in its original monastic context it described a specific spiritual crisis, a state of listlessness, joylessness, an inability to concentrate on prayer or work, a heaviness of spirit that made every obligation feel impossible and every pleasure hollow. Evagrius Ponticus, a 4th century monk writing from the Egyptian desert, called acedia the most oppressive demon of all. He said it attacked between the 4th and 8th hours of the day, mid-morning through mid-afternoon, and made the sun appear sluggish and immobile, as if the day had 50 hours. Anyone who's experienced a serious depressive episode will recognize that description with uncomfortable precision. By the 13th century, acedia had been incorporated into the developing theology of the 7 deadly sins, appearing as sloth, which was a significant simplification of a much richer and darker concept, and the pastoral literature of the period discussed it in terms that show a genuine understanding of its psychological texture. Robert Manning of Brunner, writing in the early 14th century in a vernacular handbook for parish priests called Handling Sin, describes acedia in terms that align closely with what modern psychology would recognize as seasonal depression, the reluctance to rise in the morning, the inability to find pleasure in things that previously gave it the heaviness and fatigue that did not lift with rest. And he explicitly associates it with winter. The cold, the darkness, the contracted day, the monotony of reduced food and activity. These things the medieval pastoral writers understood made acedia more likely. What they had that we tend not to have was a community management system for it. The system was called simply being together. This is not a romantically simple thing. It was a practically necessary thing. The Veli tradition, the gathering of neighbours in the longest occupied household on a winter evening, to share warmth, work and company, was not a luxury in the medieval village. It was medicine. The evidence from the folk records of northern France, and from what can be reconstructed of similar English practice, is consistent. These gatherings were regular, they were expected, and the community maintained them with the same practical seriousness it applied to any other survival mechanism. The psychology is straightforward, and the modern research confirms what the medieval world knew: experientially isolated people who are also resource depleted, cold, undernourished, overworked, deprived of variety and stimulation, are cognitively and emotionally compromised in ways that make them dangerous to themselves and others. Acedia left unmanaged bred what the medieval sources call by various names, but what we would recognize as hopelessness, paranoia, and sometimes violence. The gathering, the fire, the faces, the stories, the specific sound of another person laughing at something that was actually funny, interrupted that spiral. Not dramatically, not permanently, but enough to get through to February. There was a woman in our village, let us give her a name from the period, Marjorie. She had lived in this valley all her life, which was 50 years now, and she was not the healer, and not the reeve's wife, and not anyone particularly notable by external measures. But she was the person you went to in January when the darkness had been sitting on you for 3 weeks, and you needed to hear something that made sense. Not advice, not theology, not a sermon from the priest about the spiritual dangers of sadness. Just Marjorie by the fire telling the story of the time 30 years ago when the great frost came and the mill pond froze so solid that 3 men could stand on it and it held them all, and the miller's dog fell through anyway, and what happened then, and the way she told it, the specific details she remembered and the way she let the humour and the strangeness of it breathe, made the person listening feel for the duration of the telling that they were inside a world that made enough sense to stay in. This is not a minor thing. In January, in a closed village with the food running thin and the darkness pressing in, and the distance to spring still measurable in weeks, this was actually the most important thing. What gossip and story did together was something that I think is undervalued in how we discuss medieval community. They gave people a shared inner world. Not shared beliefs exactly. The medieval village was far from ideologically uniform despite the apparent uniformity of its religious practice. Not shared opinions, which were as various as they are in any community, but a shared texture of reference. The same stories in the same heads, the same remembered winters, the same inherited jokes, the same sense of which families had always been which kind of family and what that meant when the next generation of those families did the next thing. A thick web of mutually understood context built over decades that made communication in the village almost redundant in its efficiency. You did not need to explain yourself fully, because the person you were talking to already knew 3/4 of what you meant. This is what isolation does over time to a community that survives it. It builds a shared inner world so dense and particular that someone entering from outside, a traveller, a new priest, a wife brought in from the next valley on a marriage contract, was genuinely a stranger for years, regardless of how well they spoke the language or followed the customs. They did not have the texture. They had not been through the same winters. So here we are, February. The gossip has circulated. The stories have been told and retold. The children have memorized things they did not know they were memorizing, in the particular way that children absorb the textures of the world they grow up inside. The old people have held things together in the ways that old people do not through wisdom, in any abstract sense, but through the specific, granular, irreplaceable knowledge of what this valley looks like when the ice breaks on the mill pond, what the sky means when it goes that particular shade of yellow before a late winter storm which family will need help in March and which will have surplus and be willing to share. And the light very gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, has been returning. A few more minutes each evening, a slightly different quality to the afternoon sun when there is sun. The birds beginning to sound different in the frozen hedgerows. Small signs noticed by people who've been paying the kind of attention that you only pay when you have nothing else to look at. Candlemas is 2 weeks away, and what happens at Candlemas, what that moment of return actually felt like, and what it unleashed in a village that had been holding itself together for 4 months in the dark, is a story that deserves to be told with the care it has earned, which means it is coming right now. The 2nd of February arrives in the dark. Not metaphorically. In our Yorkshire village, the sun will not rise for another 2 hours when the church bell rings at dawn for the first Candlemas service. It is still the depths of winter. By any meteorological measure, the ground is still frozen. The road is still muddy and impassable after yesterday's rain. The food stores are lower than anyone is fully comfortable with, and the light when it comes is still that thin, watery grey of a February morning in the north of England. And yet, something has shifted. Something that is not quite a change in the weather and not quite a change in the mood, but is close to both. The village has been holding its breath for 4 months, and today the breath begins to release. Candlemas was not simply a church feast in the medieval calendar. It was a threshold, the formal, officially sanctioned turning of the year from its winter half to the beginning of its spring half. The candles that gave the day its name were not decorative. They were the primary symbol of light returning to the world after the long descent, and the ceremony of blessing them was one of the most charged liturgical events of the entire year. Here is how it worked. Every household in the village brought candles to the morning service. Not the rough tallow stubs of daily domestic use. These were better candles saved for this occasion, the best the household could produce or afford. They were brought to the church, laid on a cloth before the altar, and blessed by the priest with water and incense and the specific words of the Candlemas, blessing which had been in continuous use in the Western Church since at least the 11th century when the practice was formally established in England, though its roots in the tradition of processing with candles go back to a 5th century adaptation of older Roman purification customs. After the blessing, the candles were carried around the church in procession. Everyone carried their own light. The stone interior, cold as it always was briefly brilliant with it, more flames moving in that space than at any other time in the church's year, except perhaps the midnight mass at Christmas. And then the candles were taken home and they were kept. Used throughout the year, these Candlemas candles were believed to carry a specific blessing, helpful in times of illness, lit during storms to protect the household placed in the hands of the dying. They were not in the medieval understanding merely wax and wick. They were the light of Candlemas bottled and carried forward into the months ahead. The weather rhyme that attached itself to Candlemas in England by the medieval period has survived in various forms all the way to the present day, and in America it lives on in the entirely peculiar institution of Groundhog Day. The medieval version ran, "If Candlemas be fair and bright, come winter have another flight. If Candlemas bring clouds and rain, go winter and come not again." In other words, a clear bright Candlemas predicted 6 more weeks of cold. A cloudy one predicted an early spring. This is meteorologically the opposite of what intuition might suggest, and it is also, as it happens, essentially correct. A clear February day in northern England typically means a high-pressure system cold and dry. Cloud cover traps warmth. The medieval weather observer, with no instruments beyond their own senses and their accumulated memory of many previous Februaries, had reached the right conclusion through sheer empirical observation. This rhyme connects through a chain of transmission that runs back further than anyone can trace cleanly to the Celtic festival of Imbolc, celebrated on the 1st of February, and sacred to the goddess Brigid, who was the goddess of fire-healing fertility and the forge. Imbolc marked the halfway point between the winter solstice and the spring equinox, and its core meaning was precisely this: not spring yet, but the turn toward it, the spark of it, the permission to begin expecting it. When the Church absorbed these midwinter traditions, as it absorbed so many things, bending them toward Christian meaning without entirely erasing what had come before, Imbolc became Candlemas, the goddess Brigid became St. Brigid of Ireland, and the fire festival became a festival of blessed candles. The form changed. The feeling underneath it, the specific human need to mark the turning of the dark, did not change at all. What did Candlemas mean in practical terms for the people of our village? Let us make a list, because the practicalities were the substance of it. It meant that as of this date the period of enforced domestic closeness officially ended. The labourer who had been exempt from field work since Michaelmas was now technically available for outdoor labour again. The ground might not be ready yet, but the obligation had returned and the expectation of movement and open-air work resumed. The winter stillness that had compressed everyone into their longhouses and each other's company was formally over. It meant that the Candlemas candle on your household shelf was the last formal marker of the Christmas season. The decorations of greenery and holly that had been on the door since before Christmas, all of them had to come down before or on Candlemas, or you risked the luck of the household. The medieval mind tracked these ritual boundaries with the seriousness that we apply to, say, insurance renewal dates or tax filing deadlines. Not superstition, infrastructure. It meant for the women of the village who had given birth over the winter the rite of churching a blessing and purification ceremony that formally reintegrated a new mother into the full life of the community after the seclusion of confinement. The churching of women after childbirth was one of the regular ceremonies of the medieval parish calendar, and it was taken seriously by the women who underwent it, not as a suggestion that they had been spiritually unclean, but as a public acknowledgement that something significant had happened to them, that they had passed through something, and that the community was marking their return. The first thaw when it came was not a single day, it was a process. The Anglo-Saxons had called February Solmonath Mud Month. They were right. The frozen ground of January and early February did not melt cleanly. It thawed in layers, the surface turning soft while the subsoil stayed frozen, creating a particular treacherous slipperiness underfoot that every farmer knew and dreaded. The road into and out of the village, which has been impassably frozen for months, became impassably muddy, instead a lateral transition that did not immediately feel like progress. But the water was moving again. The streams that had been locked since before Christmas began to run. The mill pond, which had been solid enough for bone-skated children all January, cracked in 3 or 4 places and began to thaw at the edges. The distinctive sound of running water, a sound the village had not heard in months, returned to the valley in a way that was almost physically startling. You heard it before you saw it. You stopped what you were doing and listened. And the light that had been returning minute by minute since the solstice back in December, had been building so slowly that it was barely perceptible day to day. But now in February the accumulation was becoming undeniable. By the end of the month there would be a full hour more of daylight than there had been on the shortest day. The women who'd been spinning by firelight since October could now spin by the light from the membrane window for a few minutes longer each afternoon. Small, but not nothing. Here is a question I want to ask you, and I want you actually to think about it for a moment rather than just letting it drift past. What is the thing you most look forward to at the end of winter? Not the dramatic thing, not the obvious one, but the small, specific, private thing. The particular quality of the light on a March afternoon. The first morning you can open a window and the air that comes in smells like something rather than nothing. The moment when the coats come off and you realize your body has been braced against the cold for months and has forgotten how to be warm. Now imagine that moment with 4 months of genuine, unheated, darkened, socially compressed medieval winter behind it. The same accumulated anticipation, but without any of the insulation from the season that modern life provides. No central heating that kept you from fully feeling the cold. No artificially extended days from electric light. No hot food available at any hour from any direction. The full weight of the winter carried in the body. And then the first running water, the first mud that meant thaw, the first light that lasted past 4 o'clock. The medieval experience of Candlemas and the first thaw was not a calendar event. It was a physiological release, the body responding to genuine change after genuine deprivation. A particular quality of relief that we, who have spent the winter in climate-controlled rooms, would probably not entirely recognize as the same emotion. But something in it, something in the bone-level response to returning warmth and light, is preserved in us still. February still feels like the beginning of something. The light still shifts in early February in a way that is subtly different from January's light. We still respond to it even now. The village that came through Candlemas and into the first thaw was not identical to the village that had entered October. It had changed in ways both obvious and subtle. The obvious there were almost certainly fewer people in it. The harsh actuarial fact of a medieval winter was that not everyone made it to February. The very old, the very young, the weakened, the unlucky, the winter took its portion, and the community absorbed the loss with the practical grief that we have noted before real sorrow, alongside the relentless continuation of daily life. That grief in that world did not have the luxury of pausing. The subtle, the people who remained knew each other differently. 4 months of enforced proximity shared, difficulty shared, story, shared darkness. This changes people's relationship to each other in ways that are hard to articulate, but that anyone who has ever been through a genuinely difficult extended experience with a group of people will recognize. The irritations are sharper. You have seen each other at your worst. The bonds are also tighter. You have seen each other at your worst and you are still here. The shared frame of reference is denser. The village has a new layer of winter added to all its previous winters, and the people in it carry that layer together. There is a word for what a community develops through repeated shared experience over time, resilience. We sometimes say, though, that word has been overused into near meaninglessness. Perhaps what I mean is something more specific, a kind of practiced knowledge of what they were capable of. A bone-level understanding updated each winter of what the limits were and what lay beyond them, and how to hold together when the cold pressed in. The ploughing would begin within weeks. Before it could, the plough had to be taken to the church for the priest's blessing on Plough Sunday. The first Sunday after Epiphany had already passed, but the physical preparation for ploughing continued through February. In some parishes of eastern England, a communal plough was kept in the church itself, a wooden object of genuine practical importance that the parish maintained collectively available to any farmer whose own implement had failed. The practice of keeping a plough light a candle burning beside the plough in church is documented from the medieval period as a mark of the community's investment in the spring work ahead. The ground would be turned and the year would begin again. The stored seed grain, the portion of last autumn's harvest that had been set aside untouched, no matter how hungry February got, would go into the soil, and the whole extraordinary engine of the medieval agricultural year would restart. The road would open. The travelling merchants and itinerant priests and tax collectors and all the other representatives of the wider world would come back through the village, and the village would remember that it was not after all only itself. But for now, in the last days of February before the ploughing, after the Candlemas candle had been blessed and brought home and placed on the shelf, there was a brief period of suspension. Winter functionally over, spring not yet begun, the stores depleted, and the fields still cold and the road still uncertain. A few days of in-between. It was, I think, one of the most specifically medieval experiences that the calendar produced. Not the drama of the harvest, not the grandeur of Christmas, not the fear of the wolves in January. Just this, the ordinary earned particular feeling of being almost through. Agnes is standing in the doorway again. The same doorway we first found her in back in October, watching the last traveller disappear down the road. But everything is different now. The trees at the edge of the forest still have no leaves. The field beyond the garden is brown and patchy where the frost has released its grip unevenly. The air is cold, but is she imagining it? There is something in it, a different quality, a suggestion of what is coming, not quite a smell, but something in the direction of a smell, the way a coming rain changes the air before the first drop falls. She's listening to the water running in the ditch at the edge of the lane. She's not heard it since October. She goes back inside. There is spinning to do, and that for all its apparent modesty is how the medieval winter ended. Not in drama, not in revelation. In the resumption of the ordinary, the quiet picking up of work that had been waiting the unremarkable morning after the long night. The village had survived, as it always had, by means of everything we've been describing these past hours. The food stores carefully tended the fire, carefully kept the stories told, and the children watched, and the healer called, and the laws negotiated, and the darkness faced, and the candles lit, and the community held together by nothing more and nothing less than the daily ordinary effort of people who needed each other and knew it. That is the story. Almost. Because what I have not yet told you is perhaps the most surprising thing about everything we have seen tonight. Something that stays with me long after I close the last of the manorial records and the archaeological reports and the medieval calendar manuscripts. Something about what this world so different from ours in its material conditions nevertheless kept pressing in my direction a thing it wanted me to notice or that I could not stop noticing. That is what we are going to finish with. There is a Middle English lyric written somewhere around the year 1300 anonymous, the kind of thing that someone composed and passed on, and eventually someone else wrote down that reads in its original form something like this: "Winter awakens all my sorrow, now that the leafy branches are growing bare. Often I sigh and sorrowfully mourn, when I consider how all this world's joy comes to nothing." 725 years ago, give or take, someone sat somewhere in England, probably not far from a village very much like the one we've been living inside these past hours, and wrote those words, or spoke them, or sang them. And the person who heard them recognized immediately and completely what was being described. Not because the theology was correct or the imagery was sophisticated, but because it was true. Winter brings sorrow. The bare branches are a specific kind of beautiful that also hurts. The world's joy comes to nothing eventually, and the cold and the dark make that visible in ways that the warmth and the leaf cover of summer quietly conceal. This poem has survived because something in it will not go stale. Its subject is the human response to winter, the specific biological existential weight of the dark season. And that response has not changed in 7 centuries because the dark season has not changed. We are still the same animals that Agnes was. We still respond to the return of light with the particular relief of creatures who've been holding themselves together against the cold for a very long time. Let me tell you the thing I mentioned at the end of the previous part, the thing I kept noticing. I have spent a great deal of time in researching and writing this story inside the documents and the archaeology of the medieval English village. Manorial court rolls, household accounts, coroner's records, calendar manuscripts, herbal compilations, chronicle entries, the patient and meticulous reports of archaeologists working through the debris of 7 centuries. These are dry things in their primary form, lists of obligations, fines paid, grain stored, deaths recorded, and yet, again and again in the cracks of the administrative record, in the margins of the manuscripts, in the small details that nobody wrote down for posterity, but that survived anyway, again and again, I found evidence of what I can only call love. The child's fingerprint pressed into a clay toy before it was fired. The grandmother who walked her grandchild through the first difficult winter by name, teaching her which herbs were which. The husband who took a cart of illegal firewood from the Lord's forest in February, and paid the fine without apparent regret because his family was cold. The village that gathered in Marjorie's longhouse on January evenings, not because they had to, but because the dark is easier when someone is laughing nearby. The Candlemas candle brought home from the church in a careful hand, saved not for any officially sanctioned purpose, but for the moment when someone you loved was sick and frightened in the night. These are not grand historical events. They do not appear in the textbooks. They are the texture of life preserved in the odd corners of the record by accident, and they are, I keep coming back to this, they are indistinguishable from the texture of the life being lived around us right now. The same calculations, the same negotiations between what is owed and what is possible, the same warmth pressed against the dark. Here is the historical fact I want to leave you with because I think it carries everything. In the village of Warham Percy, which we mentioned at the very beginning of this story, the deserted medieval village in Yorkshire, where archaeologists have been working since 1950, carefully uncovering the bones of 6 centuries of rural English life, there is a church. It was the parish church of the village, and it served the community for 500 years. The village was eventually abandoned sometime in the late 15th century, most likely because a local landowner found it more profitable to raise sheep on the land than to support the village that farmed it. The people who had lived there for 500 years were dispersed. They went elsewhere. The church stayed. It was not demolished. It fell into disrepair slowly over the following centuries. By the 20th century, only part of the walls remained standing roofless and open to the Yorkshire sky. But the archaeologists who have been excavating around it have found something remarkable in the burial ground. Burials spanning the entire history of the village from the earliest medieval period to its abandonment. And in those burials, in the orientation of the bodies, in the artifacts placed with them, in the evidence of how the graves were maintained, they have found continuous evidence of people remembering their dead. Generation after generation, people coming back to this place to bury their parents, their children, their neighbours, their enemies. Generation after generation maintaining the graves, not as a legal obligation, as an act of something that has no better name than care. 500 years of winters, 500 years of coming through, or not quite coming through, and then being buried here by the people who did. 500 years of the same village in the same valley holding itself together against the cold. I find that almost impossibly moving. What did the medieval winter actually teach its people? Not as a romantic proposition as a practical one. It taught them the specific weight of each day. When the days are short and the resources are finite and the darkness is real, you notice days individually in a way that the long summer days of abundance do not require. You notice when the light shifts. You notice when the cold deepens. You notice the quality of the morning, the particular sound of the stream when the thaw begins, the smell of the air, when the temperature lifts by 2 degrees. You're paying attention in the way that people pay attention when the margin is thin. It taught them what they actually needed. Not in a self-help sense, in a physiological and social sense. They needed warmth, food, light in each other, not comfort in the abstract. Specific warmth, specific food, specific light, specific people. Agnes's family needed the cow's heat and the tallow candle, and the root cellar and the neighbours 2 doors down. The specificity was everything. Abstraction was a luxury of people who had enough. In the winter village, everything was concrete. It taught them the difference between what could be endured and what could not, and where that line was. This sounds bleaker than it is because the line turned out to be further than anyone anticipated. The cold could be endured. The hunger could be endured within limits. The dark could be endured. The loss when it came could be endured. What remained on the other side of the enduring was something harder and quieter, and more durable than anything that had gone into the winter. Not happiness exactly, not peace, but a kind of bedrock of the self that had been tested and had held. Do you know what the most common phrase in the medieval coroner's rolls is? Not any kind of legal formula, not a term of art. It is the phrase, "He was alive and well," used to establish that a person who is now dead was at a specific recent point in time functioning and present. He was alive and well, she was alive and well, and then something happened. And now they are not. It is the most basic of all human acknowledgements. That you are here, that you are counted, that your presence in the world was noted by someone in a document that has now survived 7 centuries in an archive, so that I can read it and tell you about it on a winter evening wherever you are right now. You are alive and well. This village was alive and well through every winter that it survived. And something of it persists in the calendar we still follow, in the candles we still light in February, in the instinct to gather around a fire when the dark presses in the stories we still need to hear. There is one last image I want to give you. Somewhere in the fields east of what was once our Yorkshire village, on the evening of a day in early March, 1281, perhaps 2 weeks after Candlemas, 3 weeks before Plough Monday, a man is walking. His name, if you pressed me, I would say is Thomas. He is not young. His hands are the hands of someone who has been working in cold and mud for 30 years. He is not going anywhere in particular. He has simply come outside because today the air smells different. It is the smell that tells you before the calendar does that the season has turned. Something unlocked in the soil, something moving in the hedgerow, birds that were not there yesterday. The light at this hour lasting 3 minutes longer than it lasted a week ago. 3 minutes is nothing. Thomas has learned to notice 3 minutes. He stands still for a moment in the mud at the edge of his field. He's looking at the sky, or at the hedge, or at nothing in particular. His face, if you could see it, would be the face of a man who has just felt something loosen, somewhere behind his sternum that has been tight since October. He has made it. The village has made it. The stores are low but not gone. Edith is still alive. The road is becoming passable. The seed grain is in the barn waiting. In 3 weeks he will put it in the ground. The year will begin. He turns and walks back to the house. The fire is still burning, and that is the story of the winter village. Not the story of suffering, though suffering was part of it. Not the story of poverty and hardship, though those were real and persistent. Not a romance, though there is something in it when you look long enough that is genuinely beautiful. It is the story of what human beings are capable of when they have no choice but to be capable of it. The story of what they built with their hands and their memory, and their willingness to sit close to each other in the dark. The story of a community that was made each year by the specific pressure of a specific season, and that emerged from it changed but intact. I've been sitting inside this story for a long time, and the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I started to tell you about in the last section, is this: the medieval winter did not happen to them. They happened to it. They went into it deliberately prepared as best they could, held each other through the worst of it, and came out the other side carrying everything they needed for the next year, including, and perhaps especially, the knowledge that they had done it before. That is a kind of wealth that no manorial roll can quantify and no lord can tax. And it was theirs absolutely through every hard and beautiful and cold and smoky and human January of their lives. Thank you. Thank you so much for spending this evening or this night or this early morning, wherever you are, whenever it is inside this story with me. You have been with me through the harvest going in, and the road closing, and the pig being salted, and the fire being managed, and the candles being saved, and the wolves being noted at the edge of the trees. You've been inside the longhouse and in the cold church and at the edge of the frozen mill pond. You've heard Agnes's spindle and Edith's footsteps in the dark and Thomas's breathing slow as the March air finally arrived. If this story landed somewhere in you, if it made the winter you're in right now feel a little different, or the fire you're sitting near feel a little warmer, or the person nearby feel a little more necessary, then it did what I hoped it would do. If you enjoyed this journey, I would love it if you left a comment below. Tell me where in the world you watched, from what time it was, whether it was winter where you are or summer, whether the story made you want to eat pottage or never eat pottage again. I read every single one and they matter to me more than you probably realize. And if you have not yet subscribed, this would be a wonderful time because there are more stories coming, and I promise they will take you somewhere just as far away and just as recognisably human as the Yorkshire winter of 1280. The next one is already on its way. Stay warm, sleep well, the fire is still burning,